So hello, everybody. I'm going to let our attendees all trickle in, but welcome to, let's see, what number are we on here? The 9th meeting of our short-term rentals working group. Great, Jim has joined us, so I think we're one member short, and hopefully Bill will be joining soon.
And since the 3 at-large are on, I'll go invisible.
All right. Thanks for being here, John. Great. And Samanish, if you can make me co-host. Just help out with stuff. Thank you. Excellent. All right. Great. So welcome, everyone. Let me share my screen to share the agenda for today. So this is, as I said, our 9th meeting of the short-term rentals working group. Our objectives today is we're going to get an update on data gathering. This seems, is this the right? Anyway, close enough. And we're going to talk about a couple of other policy levers that we got your input on, and we sent that around to you all, our sort of synthesis of what you all had to say about limiting the number of short-term rental contracts allowed in a season or a year, and also capping the total number or the percentage within an area of short-term rental permits. So that'll be the second half of the meeting. The first half of the meeting, we will hear from Process First, an update on what's been going on with them, what they're up to on collecting data, and then have any discussion about data and data timeline that the group would like to have. And then, of course, at the end, we will try to wrap up, talk about next steps and any action items, and open to public comment before we close at 8 o'clock. The public is welcome to put any questions in the Q&A spot at any point in the meeting. Just a couple of announcements. One is that Bill Gardner is going to be filling in for Peter Kahn. I don't think he is on yet, but when he does arrive, that will be happening. The other is on our end, Samanish is stuck in the New Orleans airport. So she is joining us here from that airport, and hopefully her flight will take off at some point in the next hour, which means we have
10 miles from her right now.
What?
I'm in New Orleans as well.
You are?
We should have hung out.
I didn't know.
Yeah, that's quite a coincidence, but you're probably not in the airport, David.
Definitely not. But if the flight doesn't go, give me a ring.
Will do.
And so we've asked our colleague Sinead Talley, who is on this call as well, to jump in for Samanish when Samanish has to leave to board a flight. So I don't know, Sinead, if you want to introduce yourself now, or you want to wait, give you a sec to see. Maybe she wasn't ready to introduce herself and she's just listening in.
Yeah, hi. Nice to see you all. I'm going to be off camera today. I'm kind of just chasing my toddler around this afternoon, but I appreciate being here with you all. And yeah, just here to fill in for Samanish when she boards her flight. So
great. Thank you. Thank you, Sinead. And she said this afternoon because she is in California. All right. So I think those are our announcements. Moving on to meeting summary. So sorry you had a somewhat abbreviated chance to look at it, but hopefully you got a chance. Did anyone have any questions or comments on last meeting's meeting summary? All right, hearing none, I turn to you, Tom, to do the honors.
I'd like to make a motion to approve the meeting summary from our March 14th, 2023 meeting.
Second.
All right, all in favor, raise your hands, virtual or real. Any opposed? Great. So those are approved. Any additional preliminaries that anyone wants to name? Okay. Well, with that, then let me formally introduce you all to Matt. Matt Haffenreffer, and Matt, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thank you, Stacy. Got the chance to meet a bunch of you last 2 weeks ago now. For those of you who I haven't met, Stacy, do you think I should give just a quick introduction again, or?
Yes, I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, sure thing. So didn't prepare a bio for this one, but my name is Matt. I run Process First. We're a software and data consulting firm. Been doing a lot of work in Nantucket over the last few years now. And the team that I bring to this is a team that's focused on data analytics, data cleaning, data wrangling. And, we're just really getting into the weeds now with data collection. And I'm happy to say data collection is going well, which is always the biggest first unknown. So I've been involved with a lot of different things on the island. And what I'm going to go through today are 5 things. One is a question that's been brought to my attention that I want to speak to. Second one will be an update on data collection. Third is a request for just additional data sources, leads, ideas, always giving an opportunity to field more things I might not know about. Talking through timelines, and then 5th, a review of definitions with the remaining time. Those are sort of one of the key things that I need to do my job well. Those are going to come from you all, or I'll run definitions by you, but I want to speak to that with the remaining time that we have today. Does that work for everyone?
And Matt, maybe you should also just mention who else is working with you from your team on this project.
Yeah, so the main people right now, my teammate, Alex Judge. Alex has worked with me on data analytics projects since, I want to say 5 or 6 years now. A lot of food operations data, but a lot of general analytics problems and unique challenges. Alex has some background in real estate. His family's in commercial real estate, which gives him a unique perspective. And he's worked with me since we first met on a food project. Next teammate is Carol Lee. Carol's a professor of data science and information systems at Northeastern. She did her PhD in information management systems and data science, focusing on community evaluation models. So Carol is sort of our expert in all the things that we're working on right now: data wrangling, cleaning, integration, and management. She teaches at the university and graduate level. So Carol's our highest bar of technical expertise, and sometimes our questions that are tricky, she just knows the answer to offhand or couldn't point us right to a solution that makes us really effective. And then we have another teammate working on the project, Tom. Tom is a software engineer and data analytics person. He's done a lot of integration work, and he's really interested in this, and he's helping us with setting up the tools that help process the data and doing analytics as well. And Tom's also helping to make sure we move fast because we got timelines we need to hit for this work. Anyone have questions about those guys? Awesome. So my next thing, it was brought to my attention that someone had a question about someone else who's on my team who's not involved with this work. That is Kelly Steffen. So Kelly Steffen was an advisor for Act Now. And I understand that with Act Now as a part of this group, that's something that I probably should have addressed that I didn't think to. So first I want to say that Kelly's resigned from Act Now. Kelly joined Act Now as a staff member when he was at the pantry as a staff member there to bring his perspective to the topic of housing. Kelly joined my team for the same reason. He worked on food insecurity, and that's what the work that we were doing on Nantucket largely was, and that's why we started working together. And as you guys all know, probably have seen now, Kelly's running for the land bank, which I don't think has any bearing on this. Importantly, to bring up, Kelly's also not a part of this project in any way. That's why I didn't think to bring it up. Our communications are siloed, as are the systems and data, and Kelly's not really involved. Kelly is not involved in this work at all. So I think those two things should bring a level of confidence that there's no issue there. You know, and I didn't bring it up for that reason, in that he's separate, but also the work we're doing here is technical. Kelly's not technical or a data person. He has no involvement in it. And the work that my team does, we're able to do because we operate with integrity and a care for the work we do. And what we were hired for this project is to support this group with information and accurate data. So that's what we're here to do. And then lastly, this is a data project. What we're doing is we're collecting, we're cleaning, and we're integrating data sets. There's no opinion in that work. This is very factual. And the place that there is like play, as it were, is where what data sets we have and have access to, and making sure that we have a comprehensive data set. And that's where with you all here, I'll be communicating to you guys what data sets we have, and I'll be looking for insight about what data sets that we might be missing or we don't have, that we need to make sure that you all feel that all the information we have here is representative. And of course, then lastly is where there's definitions that we need, where there's not some perfect black or white answer, but we have to provide a definition or create one. And in those situations, I'll be very transparent about how we define things, and more often than not, looking to you guys to define things or bring those definitions to me so that I can apply them in a way that makes you confident about the information that we're managing. So, you know, with all that, you know, your trust in my work is really important for me, but also for the sake of this group's ability to trust and work with that group to make informed policy. If there's more questions, I'd be happy to answer them one-on-one. But I thought, you know, I felt really confident that that information should make everyone at least have clarity around my work and the independence and integrity with which we're going to do the work. So if that works for everyone, if no one, you know, feel free to reach out to me later to speak more if you have questions. But with that, I'd like to get into what the data sets that we currently have are. Stacey, does that work for you?
Yeah, that sounds great. So if anybody has further questions about Matt's team, about Kelly and his involvement, please let me know, and we will create an opportunity to discuss that offline.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And I'm on two screens. I have a bunch of information here to share. So first, town assessor data. We have access to the town assessor data from 2018 to 2023, well, through the current year. We've had a chance to review all that, and there's just one additional data field that we'll be reaching back out to, something about housing, year of construction, which addresses one of your questions in particular. If we can't get that data point, which I think we should be able to, we have a way that we think we'd work around that. The next data set is a census and voter registry. Yeah, Dave?
Yeah, another way to get at that might be through the GIS data, because the property card that might track back to the assessor's office. But there's another way to get that if you need it, I think.
This data would be available. Thank you. Yeah, and I appreciate that. Those are always helpful just shout outs, because I think we'll be able to get it no problem, but it's always good to have a backup plan on hand. I think I saw a hand pop up and then I can't see it.
Yeah, just a quickie, Matt. Do you have anything to put on screen, or are we just gonna talk back and forth?
I was just gonna talk through this, and I figured the questions are there. If I put it on screen, it's just the words that I'm saying to you.
Okay.
Yeah, next time I can get into more like data integration models, but for now I'm just talking off a list. Is that a problem for anyone, just so I can be better prepared for next time? I know some people are visual. Okay.
Yeah, I think next time it would make sense to have something on the screen.
Okay. Yeah, sure thing. Yep, so the next data set is a census and voter registry. And the difference between those two are that not everyone that is on the island as a resident votes. You know, between children as well as people who aren't registered to vote. So between those two lists, that's our most comprehensive list of kind of who lives here and is going to largely drive the full-time resident evaluation on a property or on a building. So we have all that data. We're purchased it from the town. Yeah, I think that covers that one. Does anyone have questions about that data set? And I know that one question there is it's not the size of the island population. I think what we can do is acknowledge in certain places where whatever 10 or 12,000 is different than the total population that we believe to live here. But in terms of validating any one residence or building, I think that that's we have to work off source of truth at this point, as opposed to inferring, and we can get there on certain questions that are more aggregate or statistical level. Julia?
Thanks, Matt. So I guess two things. One is, does anyone know the difference between the voter list and the street list? Because I know that from my time at Data Platform, they definitely use the street list. And I'm not sure why. They use both basically, and I'm not sure why.
Do you mean Data Platform?
Yes. For the data population, I don't know why, but they use both, and I figure the street list is also a tool.
Julia, can you explain the difference between the two?
Well, so the street list is the census, so maybe that's what you were referring to when you say census?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then that makes sense. And then I think to Dave's point about assessor, I mean, the real value there's a lot of value in the assessor, obviously. I thought, and Megan may be able to answer this question, maybe Dave could too. I thought that the planning staff had already done the work, like Nathan at our GIS coordinator at the town had done the work of matching, or someone had matching the GIS to the registry to the assessor data. If it's not matched to the assessor, like Dave said, it's literally one away. And the value of the assessor data is huge because it gets the property details, right? And including residential exemption.
Dave, did you want to speak to that?
Well, I know, and maybe better at addressing this, but there was a map done using the state list that showed the location of STRs, but with that data, I don't think it was meant to be released to the public.
Yeah, it was released to the public. Yeah, in November of 2021, I think.
But in a broad sense, just with dots, you really couldn't tell, right, where the exact address of those houses were.
Right. Well, whatever the tool or data that Matt is using, I think that linking it to the assessor is an addition. Oh, yeah. Would you agree? Is like you said, is a pretty almost like really important part of it.
Oh, 100%. But I also think that we shouldn't be looking at names and addresses. So I think there needs to be some filter in there of some sort.
Yeah. And one challenge that I think I'll run into repeatedly, and this is where there's certain things I'll receive probably with like a big asterisk, is someone might publish something like that, and the published document doesn't actually help me if I can't access the data. And so even though the work has been done, unless they're willing to share the data set, I can't necessarily use just the map. I could use it maybe to learn or to error check or to inform or to check against, but I need the data that is behind the map in order to use that. And I think largely I'll be basically rebuilding that if they don't have that to share. One of my open conversations for data is about the state registry. And in my follow-up with the assessor's office, I will go pull on that thread and see if, as you said, Nathan has anything there that he's able to share at a useful or working level.
Megan?
I think it might be helpful if we chat offline about what portions of that data pull we may or may not be able to share, because it did cross-reference all of the addresses with the short-term rental registry. Our GIS coordinator did make a graphic of that. But of course, the raw data behind it is the addresses, the map and parcels, the ownership information. And then we did chart it by zoning district. So like the total number of STRs as registered per zoning district, and that document can be made public. I do know that for a fact, but if we want to chat offline about what specific segments may or may not be able to be released, I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, that would be really appreciated. Thank you. Can I get your information from Stacy?
Yeah, I'll direct you to Megan, connect you to Megan.
Thank you.
Sure.
Questions
Tom?
on census, street list, voter registry?
Yeah, sorry, Tom, I know you wrote in the chat, town census, not US Census. Was that what you wanted to say?
Yeah, I think that just Julia was referring to the town census, not the US Census. If anybody was unclear on that, that's all.
Apologies. Yeah, I'll try to get that terminology.
And you, Matt, were also referring to the town census?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Megan, your hand's still up. Did you have another question?
Sorry, didn't mean for that. I'll put it back down.
No worries. Great. So those are the data sets that we have from the town. The next one is the aggregators. And when I refer to aggregators, there's a bunch of platforms now that pull data from the different listing sites like Airbnb and VRBO. Some pull via API, which is essentially I'd refer to it, an API as the fire hose essentially, but for data. And an API is where you attach your software to their software, and there's agreed upon rules upon what can be shared and what can't and how you share it. And so if I ever refer to an API, I'm essentially referring to a place I can get information from others automatically or online, as opposed to say the town where I go to get a CSV file or an Excel file. So Airbnb, for example, has an API that shares their data going a certain amount back. Other sites, other aggregator sites have been scraping data for years now. So some have years and years of data and some only have, a year. And part of the decision around which aggregator we choose is based on completeness of data and a few other things. The two main ones that have been listed in the contract were AirDNA and Key Data. And we found 5 additional ones. So we're evaluating 7 different aggregator sites. And the ways that we're evaluating them are completeness of data. In other words, how far back does their data go? What platforms do they pull from? How accurate is their data? Was their ability to deduplicate locations been? As well as, of course, what services can they provide to support our working with their data? And I can list those out if people are interested. When I start there, would people like to know more about those? Yeah, Julia?
I guess the question I've been asking myself in the last couple of months, we've been talking about data is when you're collecting, my understanding is you're also collecting data from NARAB because that's the missing piece of an AirDNA or any aggregator, right? Or the realtor site listings. And although there aren't necessarily a ton of duplicates, you obviously would want to dedupe from the realtor and the platforms.
I think I just want to be careful to say we don't know how duplicated they are. I think that's an assumption I wouldn't want to make.
I guess my experience is that there is some duplication, but it's not a ton of duplication just because the commissions would be really, really high if you were doubling up on commissions, right? So Kathy, I know is shaking your head the other way, but that's my personal experience. Maybe you'll find something different.
These are not
my question
additive.
wasn't related to the to this specifically. My question was related to, do you know, I guess when you're evaluating an aggregator, are you also evaluating how you're going to get the data from NARAB to make sure that those can talk to each other? Does that make sense? That the data points that you're going to get from them are similar to the data points you can get from the aggregators?
Yeah. So by and large, the aggregators have access to the same data.
Yeah,
right? So
right.
They might create different fields to do their job of deduplicating, creating their dashboards, but more or less they're going to have the same sites. And we also have all of their sample data sets, which essentially says, here's how we present our information. And so one of our steps right now is to figure out what information they have and how, not only how complete is it, but how useful is it to us? Because complete is just a way to kind of speed up how quickly it becomes useful. If it's very complete, but it's formatted in a way that's not useful, it doesn't matter that it's very complete. So right now we've found at least one, where we have one more group that we just heard back from. We've been waiting on for a bit, but one of the sites at least has just a monthly fee and an API to some of the data. And we've actually been able to start pulling that data so we can start building our integration cleaning and cleaning model before having to pick a final one. So for more or less most of these groups, we're going to write one, make one big payment, and we're going to get one pile of data. And sure, we could go buy all of them, but with the amount of time, what we're going to realistically do is vet one, ensure that we feel confident and comfortable that it's comprehensive, complete, and will be effective for us. And then what we're going to do is integrate it into our set. What I thought I was going to have to do was make that purchase last week, but because we found an API for one with a small monthly fee, we've just started working off the API data which is essentially from Airbnb, to learn how these groups are aggregating it and bringing it to us, so we can prepare a model, buying a little bit more time to more fully vet all of these organizations. And the analogy I would use in this case is, if you had an hour to chop down a tree, you spend half of it sharpening the axe. We want to make sure that we are very careful about which data set we pick for completeness, because the impact of that will be felt throughout the rest of the work that we do.
Matt, just a quick follow-up on that. Have you found that their data agreements are also different in terms of what you're allowed to share if you do want to look at it separately than, let's say, from the realtor data?
When you say if you want to look at it, what do you mean?
Well, so my understanding is, for example, AirDNA, right? Their data agreement would say you can't share, I don't know, they want you to put it in a chart before you share it, or they want you to transform it or share half the data. It's not quite 100% clear all the time, but I guess you wouldn't be allowed, let's say, to separate that data from, let's say, the NARAB and say, here's what we got from the data aggregator. I guess does that make sense what I'm asking now?
So I don't have all the contracts in hand yet. And the other part of it is all the different data sets that I'm going to get are going to end up with different rules and permissioning. And so not one is going to determine what I can share into who. It's going to be the cumulative set of the rules with the different data sets is going to determine what is shared. And it's kind of going to be lowest common denominator. And I think the biggest wild card is still going to be NARAB, in part because of either what I have to do to deduplicate the data sets, or my hope is that I can work with them to come up with an arrangement where I have access to the information that gives us the most clarity and transparency into the work, and I don't know what stipulations I'm going to receive their data with, if that makes sense. So I think your question's important, and my answer is a little bit of a non-answer, which is I've seen some have said basically you can't use our data to go create an aggregator platform. Others are a little more restrictive, and I'm waiting for the rest of the contract still. So I think I'll be mindful of that. And one question that we talked about in the first meeting I had with you all is that I don't think, the group sort of talked about how much am I going to share and the value of sharing different depths of data. Like essentially I could give you all the raw data and you could do this instead. But since that's not going to happen, the line of what I do share is somewhere between 0 and 100. And where that line ends up being is a little bit unknown still, because I don't know what I can share. And I think it's important that you all work with me and Stacy and Samanish to figure out where you need transparency to feel certain. We'll determine how we do some of the work. And there will also, of course, be pushback as to the practicality of some of those things.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Kathy.
Two things. One, just to follow up on what you just said, Matt, about the data and the vetting process. Will there be any input or inclusion of the working group or a subset of the working group in the vetting? Like if you've got, when you have your choices to make, will that be something you'll be doing completely on your own, or will there be any participation on part of this group in doing that or giving our thoughts on it?
That's a little more open-ended than I would probably answer with a yes or no. Can you ask a more specific question?
Can I frame it this way, Kathy? Let me try this. Because Matt just sort of told us, here's the criteria he was looking at in order to make the decision, which seems to me a really good place for this group to weigh in, right? Make sure he has the right criteria to be evaluating. But, beyond that, are there specific things that you think the working group could contribute to their decision-making process that would, be important?
I think it's a little bit more flexible than that. I mean, to know what the right criteria are, you have a list of criteria, which are more important than others, for example, to this group, may be different than what Matt envisions it to be. So it's more like just a dialogue with, I'm just wondering if we can have that dialogue to figure out, because a lot of us, including Julia, have worked with this data for a very long time and have some thoughts about, well, this doesn't matter, or here's a better way to deduplicate, or here's a, maybe this is not a complete set, but it's more representative, if we all agree on that. And I don't, so I'm just throwing that out there. I can't really answer the specifics. I'm just theoretically, is this going to be done completely by your team, or will there be any, and then it's handed over to us as a done deal, or will there be any solicitation for our thoughts in the process?
Yeah, so what I'd like to differentiate in, I think, the first version of the question and the last one is the difference between, I'm always here to source input and get expertise when you have it. And you guys are you've been working this while, you're gonna know specifics and some trade secrets that I might not know. And I think that's something I'll always welcome. And with that said, I think what I'd put back to you is, after that, do you want to have influence over the decision, or do you just want insight to it? Because I think I can explain to you the criteria on which we make the decision and what are the data points I have about the platforms. But short of you going and doing a vetting of your own, I'm not sure where taking input, putting them into our decision criteria, I don't know where the line is that you would want to draw, which is really important for me to understand for sake of moving this process forward and getting the right level of input.
So Matt, I wonder if, to Kathy's question, as you are sort of getting your information about these 7 different sources, and you are sort of evaluating them along these criteria, there may be a point at which you're like, I have this trade-off to make, right? This one's a little, has more sharing allowed, but this one has more complete data, right? Yeah. Or something like that. Love to know how the group might value those things differently. We could set up a working, like a subgroup meeting.
That was my next thing, was timing. I don't want to wait 2 weeks.
Yeah, no. But the challenge is that even that we need a 48-hour notice. So if you want to figure out sort of when you think that you'll be ready to sort of have that, you'll have that evaluation complete and want to maybe hear any trade-offs people might want to make. It could be you look at them all and you're like, this is a simple equation, right? There's no trade-offs to be made here. One of the 7 is clearly superior. Then we might not need the working group to meet.
Yeah, that makes sense. So once I kind of have all my questions set and my data collected, and I think I know kind of where we're going or what direction we're leaning towards, what I could do is say, all right, we're ready. Here's my 48 hours notice. Will you set a meeting where I can walk you through what I understand about the decision and why, what we're leaning towards. And then today, what I think we could do would be take feedback on what other criteria you think are valuable to the process, which is something I would really like today to get. Does that work for you, Kathy?
Yes, as long as that would be fine. Whatever you can do, we don't want to get in your way. It's just, there's some things that might be helpful to you, and you wouldn't know if you didn't ask. Okay, follow-up question then back just to what Julia had said. I just thought it would be useful to the group to clarify for those who don't know how the different vehicles work. So real estate agents, everybody probably understands there's a fee on that's charged to the owner. But if you also use VRBO, there's no double charging. That's just a separate way to rent your house. So you could put your house on all of these platforms. It doesn't cost you anymore. It doesn't escalate the fees. They're all independent. And a lot of people, I was surprised, because I don't know how you keep track of it all, use multiple ways to advertise their home. So there will be probably more duplicates maybe than you think there are across the platforms. And so deduplicating it, I think, as you mentioned, Julie, is very important. And as long as the renter is registered with the state, which if they're not, they're violating the law, you should be able to use that ID. And that ID is required by all the vendors because they collect the taxes. and you can't advertise through the real estate agents or any of the platforms without that ID. So I can't imagine why they wouldn't share that as part of, you know, the aggregators wouldn't share that information. It doesn't give you a person's name or anything like that. It's just a certificate number. So to me, that would be the best way to do it. So thank you.
It seems so far what I've learned is some organizations have made decisions about like the group I spoke to today, they used to carry images and now they don't. They'll link to profiles, which are then public, which you could then gather the images from. But for privacy concerns, because they're a European company, they stopped carrying images. So some of these groups do or don't carry certain data sets out of just business decisions that they make, probably largely related to risk management. So that's one of the.
It's interesting. I mean, the new regulation that the town has implemented requires that you provide the town with your certificate number from Massachusetts. So
the difference in those two being, if I'm a web scraping business, I'm actively gathering data and then holding it, which is different than a town policy requiring certain sharing of information. Just from a risk management point of view, if I'm a business, I might make a choice not to hold that for that reason, which is why some of them don't. Different than if the town will end up holding that information in the future.
Yeah. And Matt, though, what I think Kathy is saying, and if I'm getting this right, Kathy, is, you know, as you're evaluating these different aggregators, the state registry ID number seems to be a really powerful tool. And it's going to be hopefully something that NARAB, you can get from their data set as well as a deduplication mechanism. And so you might want to rank that pretty high up as a requirement of what you're looking for as you're getting this aggregated data.
Yeah, so we've reached out all the appropriate channels to get that, and we're just waiting on finding out what's shareable and how.
Yeah. Okay. Kathy, does that cover your questions?
Right. And I personally, I don't care if that certificate number is shared with any of us,
right,
at all. It's just for you, but I think it would be useful. That's all.
Yeah,
I don't want to know what it is. Thank you.
And Kathy, did you have sorry, Peter, before we move on to the next question, did you have specific suggestions or recommendations about selecting aggregator platforms that I should take note of now?
Was that to Kathy specifically?
I mean, I think I don't have a lot of experience with them. Maybe Julia has more. I don't have any experience with anybody but the key data one. That's the only one that I've looked at, and I was satisfied that it answered all the kind of questions that they gave it to us based on the data elements we said the short-term rental work group needed. Yeah. So they have it, and just, you know, when they first sent it to us, just between us chickens here, I know this is a public meeting, it came with all of the names and addresses. And I said, no, please take that out. So what we sent around did not have that in there. So it's just, but I know that the certificates were in there for Massachusetts requirements. So that's the only one I have experience with. I know Julia mentioned AirDNA. I don't know how, you know, what their regulations are or anything like that.
Okay, thank you.
Peter?
Yeah, Matt, the state registration ID and the certificate number are the same thing?
I'd defer to my teammate on that, who's deep in that right now. I'm getting a couple of head nods.
This isn't very deep.
I'm just saying.
It starts with a C and it's like 8 digits long. And if you look in the state database, anytime you look at it, it's public data, it shows the certificate number.
So certificate number and state registration number are the same?
Same thing, yes.
Okay, and how do you get that number?
Well, so some of the platforms carry a data point with that and some don't. And then we've reached out to the state registry.
No, not how do we get it. How does the owner get it?
I think they register.
You register with the state as required.
This is a really simple thing, guys. And I don't think, I'm not sure, Matt, you need to do some homework on this, because the basic thing is the number, because that's how you delineate between each property. And if you get the number by signing up with the state or doing this or paying it, I don't know. I'm ignorant. I have never rented my house. But yeah, Jim seems to have an idea. Maybe Jim knows.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you get the number when you sign up with the state. You have to, jump through all the hoops of doing the sign up online, and then they assign you a number. And I think it's going to be very valuable because it can distinguish between different properties or show they're the same property on different places without revealing name or address. So it'll be a very useful thing.
What are you signing up for to get that number?
Well, starting about 4 or 5 years ago, Peter, when the short-term rental regulations and tax first started in Massachusetts, you had to sign up your property. So all of us who were renting at the time did that. And you filled out all the different stuff about, okay, here's my address, here's the bank account I'm going to use. And the first year we actually had to pay the taxes ourselves. And then by the second year, the Verbo or whoever had to collect the tax and pay it. And so we got the certificate number. It had to be on everything we advertised. If we were listed on Verbo, it had to have our certificate number there, or we couldn't be listed. I even got a call from an agent at the state, at Massachusetts Department of Revenue, asking me how good Verbo was being at tracking the stuff down. They were really following up on it, and I think everyone did a good job. It was very easy to get the number. It was just part of the process you did.
But if I see ads in the paper every week from the realtors, and they have rentals, and none of them list a state registration number.
Does anyone know how NAREB does it differently then? I mean, I think you have to have that number in order to rent.
You might have to have the number, but they don't show the number. Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
VRBO does list them on the listing. Airbnb does not, but Airbnb requires you to have it, or they will not let you list. So
how about Nantucket Realtors?
The Nantucket does the same thing. The realtors, is because they collect the taxes and have to remit them on behalf of the homeowner. So yes, they do collect it, but they may be not using it in their advertising.
Which they're supposed to do by regulation?
I don't know if they're supposed to, but they will be when we have to register in the town, because the town requires it. I'm not sure about the state.
Okay, I'm sorry to spend so much time on this, but I think if we can delineate a number to every property, it's going to make everything much easier, because I'm told by realtors that the same property gets rented by 2 different people, and they aren't 2 different rental vehicles, and one doesn't know what the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. So it's going to be interesting.
In that case, it may just be that you have to use something like, Matt will obviously make the call, but it may just be something like the property address, because you're figuring out, because you have to tie it back to a location anyways.
But there's nothing.
The only problem with that number, Peter, right now is that I have a number for my house. If I sell my house, if I stop renting, because it's a free registration, that number stays with me forever. If I sell my house and somebody buys it and then they decide to register, they're going to get another number for the same house.
Which would make sense.
You still have to use the address and the house to make sure and then sometimes they look the same, but they're not the same because there's a back property in the front, there's a little nuance, but you're going to get pretty close.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
They're useful numbers. They'll really help us.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And we do have some comments in the chat or in the Q&A. Shelley Lockwood has shared a little more information on this, that each house has its own registration number, and that it's on each lease, and it's supposed to be displayed in the house that's rented. But Kathy, as you mentioned, a house might have multiple if they've had different owners. There might be multiple numbers, although only one per house, I would imagine, is active at the same time.
And can I just clarify, when we're saying house, we probably mean each unit.
Unit, yeah.
And my understanding, the state is an ad-only list. Things don't come off it, so property could be listed more.
Right.
So the property can be listed with 2 numbers then?
Sorry,
Peter? Not at the same
time,
time, Peter, because it's basically, since there's no fee to register, you register, you never take your same name off. There's no way to get your name off there.
Okay, so you sell the property and that person registers, so the same piece of property has 2 numbers.
Right, but it's only that short-term rental is only active, technically active and being used by one person at a time or one family at a time.
I understand. I'm just looking at how we delineate what's a rental, what's not a rental. You know, having ABC on everything makes it a lot easier. That's
right.
all.
You have to say, okay, this registration goes with this property, and then is this property active right now? And that's something Matt should be able to tell by its rental history. It's not active anymore, then it doesn't count.
Right. Right. That's why just counting the number of properties that are registered is not going to give you the number of active short-term rentals.
Right.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
Ready to go on?
Sure. Yeah. So okay. So I walked through the list of aggregators. I have, you know, my main criteria are just looking at, you know, how can we access the data, our ability to pull at different timeframes. In other words, how granular is our performance data? That ideally it's by day, and so therefore it could be displayed by week or by month, as well as, you know, which platforms do they pull from? How many listings do they have per platform? How many addresses provide, have exact location in the data extract? Number of deduplications that they've been able to perform. License information, photo information, linked profile, as well as if they distinguish between booked, available, and blocked, which are the different statuses that they use with some level of nuance beyond that for how they're blocked. And then just some slightly less tangible but measure of accuracy, which is based on the samples they provide, how useful is the information going to be to us? So that's the information that we're looking at today, and the platforms that we're looking at are AirDNA, Keydata, Mashvisor, All the Rooms, AirBeatix, and Transparent, which is owned by OTA. It looks like originally they were unique companies and they look to have merged, is my sense.
Matt, maybe you can send us your, like the sort of details on this so we can make sure they're all in the meeting summary.
Yeah, of course.
Accurately.
Yeah, sure thing. Then one thing I wanted to just bring up, because I think, you know, our approach on my team is just to use a search engine and check different criteria and different keywords and to go really deep into the results to pull any unique or bespoke sites, you know, like the one that, like We Need a Vacation, one that Kathy had mentioned and was able to connect me to. We were able to get their information, but there's a lot of sites that are small or specific that have been around. It gets more complicated now in the way the internet works, where a lot of people essentially relist stuff. And so you can pull data and you seem to get, I don't know how the mechanics work, but kind of like with e-commerce, I think if you relist a listing or you point someone to it, there must be a way to get paid for it. There seem to be sites that now point to stuff that kind of will appear in a search engine like a real estate, like a rental, but it's really just a redirect or a listing. So anyways, our approach is to go really deep into all the search, but if anyone knows offhand, non-real estate offices or, you know, any sites that list that are not going to be reporting through the NARAB data set, that are not one of the major platforms, I'd love to, if anyone could just list those out if they have any that come to mind, to make sure we don't miss anything.
Sorry, Matt, are you saying you want to know the name of ones that point to, but you can't book through? Or only ones that you can book through?
What I'm saying is we'll go and do an exhaustive digital search, but because there's some that have been around a long time and don't necessarily show under the same criteria, if anyone knows any offhand, it's just helpful to make sure we don't miss any.
Yeah, so you see in the We Need a Vacation from Julia in the chat, which we know you've already been connected to. Yeah.
If people just throw in the chat as we go through this, I'll write them down, and I feel that the methods we'll use will capture them, but always helpful to have certainty if people do know of things.
Yeah, and if there are attendees who want to answer this question as well and put your suggestions in the Q&A, please feel free.
Great. Okay, going back to the agenda. So updates on data collection, requests for additional sources and leads, we covered that one. So right now we're in the phase of work where we're cleaning and preparing to integrate the data sets. Short of the registry data and the NARAB data, we now have access to all the data types. So we're in the place where we clean to bring them together. We feel pretty good about working on a timeline to make sure that we're delivering something ahead of your in-person meeting where you can have time to get something, understand it, ask questions, give feedback. And of course, the biggest concern there is just the completeness of that with or without the NARAB data set, which we don't yet have a timeline for. I've reached out for an introduction and I'm just waiting to have that meeting. But that's the one thing that in our work together, I want to give you guys just time to think about, which is, I don't know, there's probably a chance that we hit that date without that data. I'm hopeful that we have it and that we can work with them to get that information in a timely manner to bring it together in time. But I think it's worth just putting in your minds that if we don't, I think there's still useful information and questions we can ask. But I think that's where we enter into a place where we're going to have to come together and decide what's the most useful thing we can all do with that information once we have a clarity on the timeline, if it's not ideal. It's a little bit of a statement posed as a question, but just want to get it out there so you guys can think about that with some notice.
So Matt, that is to say, we do not have a firm answer as to when the data will be available. And we are going to carry on with our schedule. And Matt is going to do all that he can, Matt and his team, to bring us data that is accurate and clean and analyzed as swiftly as he is able. I think that's my summary, Matt, of what you just said.
Thank you, Stacy.
Did someone have a comment or question about that? No. Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
John?
John, it looks like you might be on mute.
You're on mute, John. John, you're on mute. John, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Strange, because it doesn't say he's on mute, but
yeah, you're somehow you might be double muted. Did you mute your?
John, if you go to your audio settings, sorry if there's a lot of background noise, and click that little up arrow, there you go. Now you're connected.
Yeah. So Stacy, no, all I'd say is I don't think we have an option, do we, other than do what you said. I mean, we've got a November meeting coming up, and we can't really stop the action sort of anytime on that thing. So it's not ideal, but I don't see an option. So I would agree with you.
And John, I really share that just because last time we met, we talked about the timelines, and I said I'd give you a timeline as I have more clarity, and I have clarity on everything, but I have no clarity on that. And so without that, I can't give you that full answer. So that's why I share that.
Well, I appreciate you trying, Matt.
I'll keep trying. Jim.
Yeah, just a question. Are we talking about the data from NARAB, or are we talking about all the data as in terms of our fear of delays or whatever?
No, I have enough clarity on everything now except NARAB data, I believe.
I see. And is there any way we can help with their data gathering? Or I know they're trying to be very helpful, and we all really appreciate.
Jim, you cut out there. Was that just for me? Did anyone else lose him there?
No, he froze.
Oh, sorry, froze. Oh yeah, my internet's wonky. Is there anything we can do to help NARAB? I know we all really appreciate their willingness to share data, and I don't know much about data, so I don't know what could be a holdup or if there's anything we can do to help. That's my question, and I realize there may be no answer to that.
So what I'll say is I've been talking with them, and there's an open conversation. They're in the coordinating all the data coming together phase, which depends on people, and people are imperfect with timelines. And I also, in my conversation with Penny, she asked that I not, present a timeline on her behalf. She'd like to speak for her timelines and not have me put information out there that isn't from the source. So, I'm hopeful, I'm under the impression that they're working diligently towards it. And in my relationship with them, I'm hoping I can get the prep work done in time, that it's not starting from scratch when they share it, but I have, preparation in place such that I'm hit the ground running with them, which would help our timelines. And I'm just letting you know that, as someone who's responsible for managing these timelines and deliverables, I don't control all the pieces that I need to give you that confidence in that answer.
I understand. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Anyone else, or should we get into some of the questions that I'm starting to look at?
I think you're good to do that.
Awesome. Okay, so one question through Stacy, you shared the Palm Springs definition, and there's two parts to that. And a second part was the in addition. So I'm gonna read it to you guys, but I'll also put it in the chat here, just for those who like to read.
And just, sorry, Matt, to just contextualize this. This is a conversation about definitions, right?
Yes. Apologies. Yeah, this is a definitions conversation now.
Right. So the question here is, right, we have a bunch of things we want to know to explore. And we say, for example, how many houses are owned by natural persons. Matt needs to know what we mean by natural persons. So that's the example I shared with him. Actually, their definition is business entity. And then they refer to natural persons. They don't define natural persons. So go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, so I think, the main places that definitions are going to come into, not the main places, they will. So far, the areas we're thinking about definitions are around defining the type of ownership, people's status as a resident or not, and the degrees within those, which are maybe important in practice, but are important in theory, but very hard to measure in practice. As well as ownership, and then the status of a building. A building can be, let me go through these. So a business can be owned by, a building may be owned by a business, an LLC, or a trust, which may be representative of a natural person, and it can be owned by a person. A person can be a resident or not a resident, and the nuance or the subtlety between those, I don't believe we can practically I'd be curious to know if people have ways to better define the subtle difference between not a resident and the various forms that it might take. And then lastly, a building can be listed and rented some amount. A building could be listed but not rented. And a building could be not listed, and we don't know, aside from, that they're not compliant perhaps, whether or not they are rented. Those are the three categories that at the moment I'm working on. And yeah, Julia, do you want to dive in on one of those?
On maybe two of those thoughts on the last point you made, which is if something is listed but not rented. Mm-hmm. So Kathy may have more thoughts on this, but certainly if you're listed on a platform, is that what you mean? Like the listing is up, right? Or
you have even if you just have a state registry ID.
Okay, so obviously, if you have, those are different. So if you're listed on the state registry, obviously that may or may not be the only piece of information you may want to look for, right? If you can't find a listing for a property, but they're on the state registry, they may not be active, right? So, but obviously if they're listed on Vrbo or Airbnb or a booking.com, or especially the bigger platforms, they really penalize you if you're listed and you don't actually, like if your calendar's open and you're basically telling people, no, sorry, I can't rent, right? They actually don't, they really don't want to see that. So they deter you from having that kind of behavior. But certainly I think you're going to find on realtor sites, that's for certain realtor sites, most of them, if it's up, it's active, but you're going to start seeing patterns with a couple of local firms where maybe they don't take down certain listings. And you're going to notice because the calendars are, you know, they just don't call us for details kind of thing, you know? And so that would be my advice there on the, I don't know if that's helpful. On the part about ownership. So this one I think is really tricky, and I understand Palm Springs may have it down like as a science, but
well, they have it down, but they also have enforcement or a team that's job is to manage that. And that's one of the practical challenges. But
right, they have 12 people on the enforcement team. Exactly. So because the way I've seen it is you may or may not see the entity listed on, you know, and as a beneficiary on, like, let's say an LLC. What you're likely to see are individuals, and that there are sort of multiple layers to get to figuring out, gee, what company am I really dealing with if I'm dealing with a company? And I think that that's a really big challenge in this case.
Yeah, and before I ask questions, this is a place I just love this group to just start sharing ideas and perspectives on that.
So Karen and then Peter. Karen.
I was just going to say that it could be that a property has a number, is registered, but they don't list anywhere because they do it word of mouth, or they don't, you know, they don't advertise. So that might be, it might not, they may be active, but they're not advertising anywhere. Mm-hmm. So I guess also on the LLC question, I think, you know, some may, are you saying that if it's listed as a company, a name other than individuals, that it would be hard to identify? So for example, you know, we have an LLC and we came up with a name that kind of honors my grandfather. So I don't know how low you have to go to get to the fact that it's owned by two people. So. Right. And so I think regardless of doing that for all the properties, what we know is in that case, the LLC is or represents a natural person, I don't know if is or represents, and the interpreting of all the information versus the truth are different things, right? We don't know what the truth is, we know what information we're presented with, and those are importantly different when it comes to managing data sets. So what you're explaining is exactly that. That's an LLC representing a natural person.
Right. And Matt, sorry, if you could just be like, the point you're making is, right, you may have information in your data that says whether something's a property is owned by an LLC, mm-hmm. but you do not have in your scope the time to chase down every LLC to determine whether that LLC is made up of natural persons or not.
That's not a thing we've gone deep down yet. And I think next time I present to you, or I could come back with questions if I have it sooner, I can say, you know, here's the depth that I can get to quickly enough, or here's the kind of breakdown of how this information falls now that we've pulled all of these. And hey, only a few of them feel like I'd have to go down the rabbit hole to get it. But it's just at this level, I'd like to, I'm seeking input on how I should manage those, that nuanced situation that may require further research, or that I'll need to manage because it's more research than is reasonably available. And I just don't have that answer for you yet. So I'm at that information and definition gathering phase.
Yeah. Okay. Peter, I know you raised your physical hand, so you're next.
And now my natural hand. I think, and I'm ignorant to this case, but I do think you can go one step beyond the name of the LLC and get the LLC manager. And the LLC manager is usually a natural person, or some way to get to a natural person, if it is a natural, you know, if it's not owned by some machine.
And I think that's helpful, and I think I've seen that case in the data, but I don't think that actually is a conclusive outcome, because it could still be it could still fall into other buckets in spite of having a natural person's name on the LLC at that high level.
I think you're right, and I want you to do your best, but I don't think we hired you to be a cop. So I think, you know, you can only do what you can do.
Right.
Unfortunately, enforcement is our biggest problem with everything that we do on the island.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, and some of these conversations at this stage, right, and even when we get there, right, the part of the conversation here is this is information that we're just not going to be able to get for this, right? If we want to know, if we were to ban business entities, according to this definition, from owning short-term rentals, how many properties would be impacted? We're not going to be able to get the answer to that question, right? I think that's important to know. Now we can try to take guesses based on the information we can get, but we're just not going to be able to get that information. There was a suggestion in the Q&A, oh, could Nantucket require this as part of their registration going forward? Perhaps, right? If you don't have an enforcement department, not sure how much that's even going to help you. But the point here is that we just are not going to have it for this decision-making process.
And what I'd add to that is, in this work, I'm happy to provide you guys my team's input as to if you had this data point or this set, or if you approach it this way, this could be really clear from a technical point of view or a data point of view, as opposed to, and I've gotten you that information. It might not exist, but I might be able to say this would be really helpful. If you guys want that level of feedback from me, it's sort of different than analysis work, but it's stuff that might show itself because of the analysis work.
Yeah. Okay, Jim.
I agree completely with what Peter and Stacy just said. We have to distinguish, I think, between a value we set. If we do set a value of no business entities doing STRs, that's one thing. And our ability as data gatherers to prove that, I don't see how that's possible. I think we would need to decide as a committee or as a town that this particular provision is so important that we do have to raise the cost of having a license so that we can have some sort of enforcement division. You know, that might be a decision we have to make as a committee or as a town at some point. It can still be a useful value, but I don't think we can expect Matt's group to determine this at the deep level it would need to be done at. Maybe to a certain level, but anyway, it's still a useful value to have. And just one other thing, the resident versus non-resident. I don't know if this group has been going in that direction. I'm just not sure of that. My personal opinion is maybe that's not as important as some of the other issues we've talked about. And I think that's probably something that's very, very hard to determine in any event. Thank you.
Yeah, though I would really be keen to hear people's thoughts about, because there have been proposals out there that differentiate between residents and non-residents, or residents of different kinds. And so I would be curious to hear people's thoughts for Matt about the extent to which you would like him to try to clarify resident, non-resident, part-time resident, full-time, however you want to, which are the definitions you would want him to be trying to use. Right, as he said, he has the voter registry. That's one criteria, right? There's the exemption we've talked about before. That's another. Whether those all line up or not, I don't know. But I think now is a good time to sort of weigh in on that for Matt as well. Kathy.
Okay, just too quickly, I know that the town did something when they were looking at the data back when, and I don't know if Dave Iverson has any remembrance of this, but there was something where they said, oh, they somehow did some kind of a vetting process, and it was probably not very detailed about trying to figure out which were commercially run and which weren't. And I don't know what the answers were on that, but there was something that they did that might be useful information. It might not. So Dave has got his hand up. He can probably answer that. And then the resident, non-resident thing, I thought it was very interesting that it was not a thing that any of the panelists that we talked to last week considered. That was not a part of their process, although on the other hand, Nantucket's different than other places, but I think that it's probably less important. I agree with Jim in setting the rules. I think it makes it more of a consensus-based thing, or more of a community-based thing, if we're able to come up with something that is not discriminatory in any way. So that's just my opinion on that. And I know that the advisory committee folks, that's important is important to that group as well. Thanks.
Thanks. Julia?
Yeah, a couple things, I guess. So one piece of information that's, I think, interesting about the LLCs, and I don't know, Matt, if you're considering, I, for one, think that it is very difficult to figure out what Palm Springs has apparently done. And obviously we're talking about resources. What's a lot easier to figure out is, at least for most of them, like, where's the LLC based, right? The address on the LLC. And that, you know, you can look at the assessor data, obviously, and you can look at your resident list or your voter list or whatnot. But I do think that even though, let's say, the general rule might not be very different for year-round or non-year-round, or for owner-occupied or non-owner-occupied, but when we're talking like what Jim just mentioned about like hiking the fees to a point where you are going to basically create an enforcement team, I think that it may make sense to have, let's say, tiered fees for, let's say, owner occupied, or, kind of year round or renting their own home, because I mean, there's a ton of like accountability there. And I think you're going to get a lot of pushback if you really start hiking those fees from people who are doing kind of they're making less income than maybe. I'm just suggesting that as, there's a potential to tier some of this stuff down the road. And so I do think that having the knowledge of, where the rental is based or what the ownership is based, I mean, may be helpful. And I guess the voter list, unfortunately, if you're a Massachusetts resident, and even outside Massachusetts, there's quite a few voters who don't live year round on the island. And so, that's probably not the best. It's a good source, right? But it's probably not what you would bet your life on. And so the assessor data, I think, comes and really reinforces that actually as a good fallback.
There's some stuff that we're just getting deep enough to start to see when and where, certain things are, I'll say like unit granular, like there's a data point for each thing and there's a level of confidence in each data point. And then there's certain things that are like, we have 70% of the data points, but we think it's representative. And in those scenarios, those are sort of different levels of imperfection and understanding, and different questions we're answering for you guys will fall into those sometimes. Some should be perfect and those are the best, but sometimes it's going to be like, hey, we had 80% of data, and here's reasons why it may or may not be representative, and here's what the 80% that we do have says. Versus we have data points for everyone, but we're not sure of their accuracy, or they're only so accurate because of, the question that we can ask of that category. Maybe it's like categorical data instead of quantitative, so we can't answer it. I don't know. That's a little too generic to be helpful, maybe. But
I guess like as long as you're somehow, whatever the word is, like using multiple sources, I think, and they're validating, right? Versus contradicting themselves, then I think that that's where you're going to increase your level of confidence, right?
Yeah. Sometimes when we're working on questions that truly can't be answered with certainty, there's no perfect answer. What we'll do is we'll calculate them roughly multiple different ways. And once those three things are approximately the same, we're like, okay, we're within the same error bars. So even though no approach is foolproof or studied to be accurate, we're confident that we're within the error bars. And then you start honing in the variables. And if they keep aligning, and that's where it's a little bit sometimes art as much as science. And that's where we'll be, transparent with you of here's the thing we made that's not perfect. Here's how we've approached it. If you got a better method, shout it out.
But that'll be a lot better than what we could have done. So.
Great. So let's try and move through these swiftly. John.
I'm just, for us, the natural person concept has been, has become so important. I just want to come back to the LLC and can we really understand whether there is a natural person or not? Matt, what if we, once you're sort of going down through your work, I mean, if you have a list of, let's say, 100 that you say, you know what, this 100 LLCs, I can't tell from what we've got, you know, who they are, where they are. Well, let's just say it was 100. We could probably, if there is a process, a manual process for us to figure that out, well, you know, maybe 10 of us take 10 each and go through the manual process. If it's 1,000, well, obviously that's not going to work. Yeah. But I would just wonder, Stacy, if we should, you know, just put that on the table for Matt, that if there is a reasonable number that need manual intervention and he doesn't have the resources or the time to do that, well, maybe I'll sign up for sure to do so. No, you have a lot of other stuff, Peter.
I'm just saying you can't do it. It's part of open meeting.
Well, let's not argue that tonight. Let's find out if there is a way, and if there is, let's try it. If there isn't, then there isn't. That's all I'm saying. Let's not just not take it one step further. Thank you.
And can I? This isn't an assumption, but I'm going to try to pose a hypothetical that I think would outline that situation, which would be, let's say there's, I'm going to use just really round numbers, 1,000 total, 900 have been categorized, and 100 aren't categorizable. And the difference between answering a question importantly or not is probably in that 100. Maybe the 900 are representative and there's nothing out of line. They all follow the pattern. And we could say the other 100 are probably just like the first 900. Or maybe the reason we can't categorize the 100 is because there's something else that we can't categorize, and that's why we need to understand them. In that scenario, that's one where it'd be important to go understand that thing, knowing that I haven't defined what it is or if it's solvable with brute force. Is that what you're getting at, Peter? I mean, John, sorry.
Yeah, it is. I just think if we're going to do that, and I think that's a very sensible approach, Matt, but we all have to agree that, look, we are making an assumption that 100 look like the 900. So let's not raise our hand 4 weeks down the road and say, well, wait a minute. You know, so we just all have to sign up if that's what we're going to do. Thank you.
Mary.
So I agreed with what Julie was saying. I mean, the LLC, I think it would be interesting to see what ones are all associated with the same address. It's pretty easy to figure out who owns an LLC. I literally have just Googled them and it comes up and says, a website comes up and says who owns it. And so you can tell if it's a person or a company. And at the select board Board of Health meeting, they discussed doing tiered fees as far as like with the size of the house. So that somebody who's renting out a 1-bedroom cottage, maybe, and it's not going to start now, but that maybe eventually they would pay a different fee than someone that's renting out a 4,000 square foot house. So that was discussed. And I think that it would be a great idea to be able to use the money to have our own enforcement department.
Yeah.
David?
Yeah, a couple things. One, it would be amazing to have an enforcement department, but it would have to be paid for by the fees, and the fees would probably be astronomical if we were going to hire full-time staff members. I mean, I think it would get out of control quickly. The town has hired someone, and we'll see how that works out, I guess. The second thing is and don't get me wrong here, I'm not against restricting forms of ownership, but we can't be restricting them by where a person resides. I think New Orleans found that out the hard way. Their STR restrictions on out-of-state people got shut down by the state Supreme Court. So I just think we need to tread carefully in that territory. I just think, you know, you can't tell someone because they don't live on the island they can't rent their house. But I do think that there is some merit to look into forms of ownership. Thanks.
Thanks.
Can
And
I
yeah,
ask
there's
one
some
question before you go to Peter, just in case we're changing topics?
Yeah, and I just want to note there's some conversation in the chat about this topic. But go ahead, Matt.
Yeah. One question. So a building, again, in my list of 3, a building can be owned by a business, LLC or trust representing a natural person or natural persons, or a building can be owned by a person or persons. At some, so I think about me, I run a sole member LLC, which is, a legal designation, but tax-wise, it's me, like my personal and business taxes combine. How do we differentiate between a natural person using an LLC acting as a business from a person protected by an LLC? Is there a point at which a person is it the performance, the way they use the property? Is that the point at which it changes?
The tax returns.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to pull that out, right? I mean, the tax returns might help you, but are they running it as a business or are they running it as a tax shelter? Like, yeah. I think that's a difficult thing. I mean, we all couldn't probably agree commercial use is. So I think that that's a difficult discussion. I mean, inherently, any LLC can give you tax benefits. That's why people use them. And are we going to punish people for that? I don't know. I mean, that's part of the bigger question, I guess.
But I think my question is more like, if I'm going to categorize building ownership, if a person owns, pick a number, 4, they certainly aren't living in 4, but if they live in one and rent one and rent one, if they live in one that they rent and they rent another full time, is the one that they live in and rent, it's an imperfect thing. And I think maybe what we end up doing is presenting numbers as opposed to categorical quantification, but like, here is the breakdown, or here's how it's distributed, or putting people, like we might be able to put it, here are the number that fall under each of these scenarios. But I was wondering if this group had any consensus on at what point, where the line is at which renting becomes business by a person as opposed to just a person renting.
Just to say, Matt, the group hasn't really spoken about that issue. Okay. They have focused much more on the differentiating corporate or sort of whether there are natural persons behind it. They haven't talked about whether one person with an LLC renting a house they don't live in should be treated different than another person renting a house as an LLC, a house that they don't live in, right? Like, except to the extent that they have started to talk a little bit about perhaps limiting the number of rental contracts that anyone might have. So how many times is it rented? How often is it rented, as opposed to, lived in by family members, et cetera?
What I'm really getting at is one of the questions that you've asked me to answer is about ownership type of buildings or of rentals, and the categories by which I would categorize them into aren't inherently unique. One could be many, and that's just where I'm looking for. What I could do is maybe start digging in and say, how important is that question? Maybe it's a really fringe thing and the detail isn't worth us spending hours on, or it becomes, yeah, Dave?
Or, I mean, I think that, and hopefully you'll pull these numbers out. How many people own multiples? And out of those people, how many do they own? Right. And I think that would give us at least a clear look. But I think another great fear that we hear from the community is corporate owned. And that doesn't mean you own multiple. That just means that corporation has invested in a house at the corner of Back Street, right? and it may only be one house, but is that what from what I'm hearing, that's not what we want as a community, is we do not want that. So I think that the ownership is an important piece, and we'd like to know how many properties are owned by corporations, how many are owned by separate individuals, the ones owned by separate individuals, how many own multiples, and how many multiples do they own? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Was there something else you were going to say, Dave, with your hand up?
No, I'm sorry.
That's fine. Peter?
Just two things. One is enforcement's not a money problem. Enforcement is a people problem. So we can throw all the money we want into it, raise the fees to whatever we want. We can't hire anybody to do the jobs. So that's the biggest problem. Housing. It all comes back to housing. Secondly, Tom, can you fill us in on the Fifth Circuit decision? Because I wasn't aware of it.
Just a little bit. Julia and I were kind of chatting about it in the chat for a second, but what I remember is that, and I should have the town council written answers here, but it was something like there was a New Orleans regulation that attempted to separate resident ownership from non-resident ownership. And there was a lawsuit, and that went to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and that was overturned per the Commerce Clause. And so town council weighed in and a little bit on that, and exactly what council told us. It was foggy because it was in September, October, but what I was relating to in my comment is just that, yes, we're having a data conversation, and we just to help inform all our decisions, but just that we don't want to waste, not that we're going to do it, but just don't want to waste time going down a road that's clearly not constitutional or ends up in more litigation. Julia, do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, sorry, Jim, I know you've got your hand raised. I think it was an important discussion. When town council was at the meeting, I think what Giorgio said is that Fifth Circuit, that's not, necessarily what would get decided here. But furthermore, there are certain terms that were not used in New Orleans. New Orleans sort of, I think it was even in state, out of state, like it was really going against the Commerce Clause. So I think he mentioned some terms like owner occupied. And I know that, Brookline has residency, or there are a lot of towns and cities in Massachusetts that rely on some of these terms, whether it's hosted or owner occupied. But I think he said you would probably stay away from year-round resident. Yes. Like there are certain terms that you'd stay away from, but it doesn't mean that you can't sort of get to where you're trying to get to, I guess.
Okay. Jim?
Thanks. Yeah, two things. Yeah, I agree with what Julia said. I think what town council said was that decision might not be made in New England and Massachusetts because it's a different court down there in New Orleans. However, I agree we should probably stay away from it just in case. But Matt, back to our question on business versus people owning. I don't think when we talk about business entities, we're talking about a natural person owning 3 or 4 or 5 properties. I think we're talking more about, like Dave said, a corporation owning maybe only 1 or maybe owning 12. That's what this group has been concerned about in terms of this particular issue of ownership of corporation versus a natural person, no matter how hard it may be with some LLCs to determine that. But I think Meredith is probably right. We can't often determine that. So I think what we're really, just to further clarify, this group may or may not, I don't know, put in a regulation to try to limit natural people owning only 1 property or maybe only 2 properties in the future, while probably grandfathering in people who own more now. I think we've all sort of not totally agreed on this, but there's sort of a general consensus that grandfathering in will help people accept new terms. But in any event, I don't think it's one person owning 5 businesses means it's, quote, commercial or business. I think it has to do with being a corporation versus being a person. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe it's important, Stacy, to see if there's consensus, because that answer I think is a helpful set of, that's a helpful definition for me, if that makes sense to the group.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there's agreement on that, but I do think, Matt, by people do want to know if people have multiple and how many they have, and you can report on that whether or not you use the word corporate or not, as compared to, is it a natural person or not, right? You don't necessarily, I'm trying to split the difference here. People are interested in both of those things. That is, how many people or entities own and rent multiple STRs, and how many do they own or rent? And they're also interested in, are they natural persons versus corporate or profit bearing entities, right? And we know the extent to which you can get to the bottom of that is going to be limited by how transparent the LLC structures are.
Yeah,
I'm saying that right. Jim, does that get to your point, but also those who want to, as you already heard, people who want to know about the number as well?
Yes, perfect, because we do want to know both, but they're separate issues, and they will probably be dealt with separately in whatever regulations we end up suggesting.
Yeah. Julia.
Yeah, Stacy, I was just going to, I guess you just clarified, and I was just going to agree with Dave about, yeah, we do want to know the number in terms of any ownership, right? A common ownership. And I think one of the reasons this group in particular has been talking about the community impact fee. And, I haven't had my hands on the registry, the full registry, for a couple of years now, but back when I had the last version I had, the state actually tracked the number of properties of STRs to which it would have, basically it would have qualified them for the community impact fee back then. And there were 330 properties. So it wasn't like a small number. And those, I think they determined those as being under the same ownership, and at least 2 units that are not, one of them was not where the person lives. So I think that the data that Matt spits out is going to be, helpful into looking at the impact of that fee if this group decides to put that forward.
Yeah, Matt, that is an important, thanks for mentioning that, Julia. That is an important sort of benchmark, because state law doesn't let you decide how, like, if you want to do this community impact fee, it's already defined by the state that it must be, you must own, what is it, 2 or more beyond your own home. We can send you the definition of that one, Matt, because that's defined by state law. So that's going to be an important one for the group to know.
Thank you. So can I just summarize? I mean, I'm now hogging a lot of this meeting, which may be okay. Maybe the point
we're gonna need to shift soon.
Yeah. So I'm going to review the 3 main questions that I entered with. One, a building can be owned by a business, an LLC, or trust representing a person and a person, and those aren't necessarily definitions of intent of their activity, but the type of organization that owns the building. That's my current understanding, and I will report back as we have to further define nuance there, or as we learn where we need more nuance. Second is, a person can be a resident or a non-resident, but any further definition between, that would differentiate between someone who's here 100 days a year and 1 day a year, we don't have for the purposes of property ownership. And then third, a building can be listed and rented some amount. A building can be listed and not rented, and a building can be not listed. And, in that scenario, I think we presume that therefore it's not rented, and everything else falls into that category. Those are my 3 main takeaways and critical definitions for today. I will follow up with summarizing those once my team's reviewed them in context of the data, as opposed to slightly more abstractly. And I will share them back with you all through Stacy.
Yeah, just want to add two things to that, Matt. One is, as Karen said, if it is listed in the registry, but not listed on platforms, it still may be rented. So, but there may be no way to know that. So it's just sort of to keep that with people may do that by word of mouth or only to their.
I'm using listed as meaning it is sort of like active, or it could be active, as opposed to listed on a site versus having a registration.
Right. And then I think, I think this, but people would like to know how often they are rented. So you say, right, it's listed and rented, or just listed. Or, I mean, people want to know much more detail about how often, when, how long they're rented, all those sorts of things.
So that information's all, I would agree, just as important, but is less open for interpretation. That to me is a simpler activity, because it's just, it was occupied, and I can apply that to a location which has now had all this definition applied to it. But yeah, of course.
Okay. Really important. Kathy?
And just one other thing that I've mentioned before, but I just want to put it back on the table, is to make sure that whatever the data sources that you do use, that you get rid of the bed and breakfast and hotel rooms that are listed under Airbnb. I don't know how you do that. In theory, they shouldn't need to have a certificate for the short-term rental, because that's not what they are. They're already in another category, but I just want to make sure that those aren't also counted, because they do skew the data.
Sure, absolutely. I'll make a note of that for the team.
Oh. All right, great. Well, thank you very much for all of that, Matt. I think that's a helpful starting point, and we will, I will of course Matt and I will stay in close contact. We will let you all know if and when it makes sense to bring together a subgroup to talk about any decision points around which aggregator to go with. And of course, any updates on the timeline we will also share. But beyond that, I think, Matt, we're going to assume that, well, you and I will talk further about what by next week, what you think and what you can anticipate you might be able to come to the next meeting with by way of data.
Yeah, absolutely. And Stacy, is it all right if I
you may
stay for the rest of the meeting?
You may go.
Oh, I was gonna stay and listen. But...
Yes, you may stay. You also may stay, but just turn off your camera so we get the primary members on the screen. Perfect. All right, everybody. Let's see if I can make this work here. This is the right one, right? Capping the number of STRs. Okay, so I sent this out to you all in advance. For time, I don't want to get too detailed in my reading from the slides, but I do want to just sort of walk through. We have two policy mechanisms that we asked you all to look into or to give us your input on. One was a potential for putting a cap on the total number of short-term rental licenses that are provided on Nantucket. And the second was to limit the number of rental contracts that any operator of a short-term rental can use. So let's look at sort of what all of your feedback was on that. Because these weren't super well defined, we started with just some questions of how would you really want to define this? And so I gave you a couple choices. And this was, so we got create geographic boundaries was the most popular of these choices. Of the sort of 10 responses to this question, half of them were supported geographic boundaries. So that would imply quite a lot of conversation to come about what that might look like, what those geographic boundaries would be, et cetera. And for among those, this 4 that said set different limits in different areas, you could choose more than one here, right? Select all that you support. So presumably of those who wanted to create boundaries, it was because they wanted to differentiate limits or caps in different geographic areas of town. We had 3 people who just wanted to limit, although I didn't check to see if people checked more than one of these, but 3 people who said that they also supported, or that they solely supported, limiting the total number of permits or the percentage of residential properties on the islands that could have short-term rentals. We had 1 person wanted the same limits in all areas. And then we had, these were 2 others. One did not support caps, and another maintained the current level via grandfathering or have no caps. So when asked to explain, you know, a few people added some information about the geographic, and some noted that broad boundaries might be a good way to do it, with sort of a limited number. So that is not by every single zoning district, but to actually to try to designate a couple of areas and designate that way. People talked about densely populated areas, that short-term rentals have a disproportionately negative impact, perhaps because they take away from places where year-round residents might otherwise live. People noted the diversity of lot sizes might make a difference, so maybe that would affect one way or the other, the way you might geographically change these things. And then a few other people said simpler is better, and had some concerns about the complexity of the different areas and what the rationale might be for those different areas, given the time that we have at this point. Two people actually mentioned something like the current number of STRs, or 20% of housing seemed like the right, if we were to sort of be aiming for like how many would we want, said that seemed like about the right time, though we didn't ask that question in particular. Julia?
Isn't the biggest issue with this particular policy lever that I'm not sure I'm understanding? Would we be telling the people who, let's say, haven't been doing it or can't fit in the cap that no matter their scenario, I mean, maybe you could rent a room in a house, you know, if you live on the island year round, maybe that would be an option, but you would not, I mean, you'd be taking that away from, let's say, any new like home ownership opportunity. You know, I'm having a really hard time understanding how this is going to fly.
Dave? You're muted.
Through you to Julia, what is it that you don't understand how we would implement it, and that your concern is that we would shut people out?
So let's say the cap is 20%, which means like we're really close, right? Let's say the program goes into effect this year or next year, whatever, right? And let's say the cap is reached. Let's just assume for, you know, practical, for the conversation, hypothetically speaking, let's assume we hit the cap really quickly. And let's assume that, you know, if you're, let's say you're year round, you haven't been renting because you're using your home, but, you know, you're thinking of retirement, your kids are moving out for college. All of a sudden it becomes clear to you that, you know, this is income that would be really important for you to keep your house and pay for college or whatever the case. So I just have a really hard time understanding how the voters are going to say, yeah, I haven't been doing it. You know, the majority of voters haven't. I haven't been doing it. So, but I'm going to cut away my ability to do it in the future.
So I understand that. I mean, I really understand that. I think that that's the problem when we start toying with property rights. Who has the right and who doesn't?
But this is just, to me, like when people talk about like you can and you can't, this is very, you know, you've been doing it, good for you. No, and we're going to reward you.
I agree, but I think that the community as a whole wants us to look at this, and I think that in my mind, yeah, it's the ones left out in the cold that all of a sudden want to rent. Because in my mind, if we do caps and we would try to stay away from grandfathering, because you lose any control over something once it's grandfathered. I've said this many times. Like,
I can appreciate that. I totally get where you're coming from. My question is, don't you need two sets of rules then? Don't you need to guarantee the year-rounders' ability to do it?
I mean, I think the beauty of caps is that they can be toyed with.
Well, then you're saying it's an unlimited cap.
No, but what I'm saying is, okay, we decide to cap in a certain area, and let's say it's less than already exists there. We're not going to remove those people's right. We'll let them come off as people come off or don't rent anymore. We'll go below the cap number, and it will make it available for other people. Listen, we're looking to regulate these. There's going to be some hard points where people can't rent anymore. That's what this is about. And just because it's a local that they're now they want to rent their house, what's the difference between them and the Off Island guy whose kids have left and they don't come to Nantucket anymore as much and they want to rent their house? So I think there's always another side to this.
I guess I'm surprised because I would just assume that there would be some understanding that the year-rounder who is trying to buy, I mean, there is no homeownership option right now, period, right? But let's assume the market softens a little bit. Let's assume a couple things happen and there are certain buildings that happen that, like, you know, all of a sudden there's opportunities for ownership. Renting is literally one of the ways that year-rounders have made it possible to be able to afford a home. How are you going to take that away?
So we do not have to solve that question.
No, I know, but it's an important one, and I don't mind stopping. It's fine. It's an interesting dialogue, though. I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's raising the point, Julia, your concern about this particular mechanism, but I think it raises sort of your general, like, maybe this could be done in combination with other mechanisms that would address this, but it does seem the concern you're raising is, yes, we want to regulate short-term rentals, but we don't want to hurt year-round people, owners. And so if the group all agreed with you, then you would, as a group, really need to look at mechanisms that differentiate between year-round and not year-round. So that, you know, that's important to know and discuss, but it may not be universally shared.
Understand.
Agreed. I mean, I look at caps as more of a surgical intervention that can be adjusted and changed by the select board. Right? So, and that's just in my head. I don't know if that's reality or not, but I 100% appreciate where you're coming from, Julia. I just think when we sit down at the table to regulate, there is going to be some pain involved. And I don't personally want to inflict pain upon anyone, either locals or the people from Off Island, but there's a cry to regulate in some sense. And regulation in some ways is a no, or kind of, or maybe, you know, it's not everyone's going to get what they want.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. Kathy?
So I agree with Julia that caps, I think caps are a bad way to regulate. I don't think that the caps, when we talked about them with all of the other panelists that we spoke with, none of them had reported any great success with them for a variety of reasons. And so we were looking to find experienced people who could advise us. So I think that, Dave's saying, yes, someone's going to get hurt. And I think, this is a financial situation. People come and go from the island. Their status as year-round and not year-round is very fluid. People who were just, vacationers, then they bought houses, then they retire, and then they become year-rounders. And so your status changes a lot through time. And so making that status be protect, if someone's going to lose their house, that's painful. It doesn't matter if it's a year-rounder or somebody who's had a family house for 3 generations. You don't want them to lose that house just because they don't happen to live on the island anymore. So I think this is hard because of what Julia said, and that someone's financial situation changes and all of a sudden they can't rent and they need to. I just think that's just an unfair thing. And I think we have enough levers here we can use that we don't need to consider this one upfront. And we heard also that that it's an iterative process, the regulatory process, and that towns learn from what goes on. And I would rather start with other ones first and see how they go, and then decide whether we needed to deal with this, because it's a very, I think more people would get hurt than be helped. Thanks.
Thanks. Jim?
Very quickly, I agree completely with what Kathy just said. Caps seem interesting. They might be good at some point, 5 or 10 years down the road if we need them. I think they're too controversial now. We want to keep our initial offerings simple and elegant and ready to be accepted by the town. And I think this would create so much controversy that it could be dead in the water. Whether or not they'll be good 5 or 10 years from now, I think that's possible. But I think we should forget about a cap for this year. That's just my.
Great, thanks. John.
Yeah, I don't think we should forget about caps for 5 or 10 years. And the reason for that is a lot of what we've heard the last meeting and other things that we've read is that, short-term rentals can get away from a community really quickly. And we're in a fortunate position right now where we don't have to probably reduce at this moment. We're probably at a number that we can live with. But I think if we just turn a blind eye to it all for 5 to 10 years, it will be too late. I think, when Dave was talking about regulation, I think we do need some regulation that keeps us where we are without hurting people in their current situations. But I think it would be a mistake to let this thing go for 5 or 10 years. I think by then the horse will be out of the barn. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Julia.
Just very quickly to go back on, just in case I wasn't clear. I don't disagree with the idea of a cap. We've seen a lot of communities use them. And I agree with John that if they're not done quick enough in a way, the thing just, and frankly, I understand what you're saying, John, like we're not in that, I don't think we're in that fortunate of a scenario. Like I was reading about Bozeman, Montana today, and they have 3% of their housing stock in STRs and they're all up in arms. And I'm going 3%. We've got close to 20. Like we're, we are approaching levels that I think other communities might say, it's a little concerning. And so that being said, my issue, I think you articulated it correctly, Stacy, is it would be in conjunction with something that would allow year-rounders to continue to be able to STR in order to afford homeownership. That's the only thing. So I still think it's a valid tool.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just going to walk through these slides quickly. And so it's sort of interesting here. Most people said we need more data to know if we should be trying to maintain or decrease. But those who thought if we decreased, people thought maybe through attrition as people don't apply. Some thought don't allow it to follow for a sale. Nobody thought you shouldn't allow it to be passed down that right. Other comments, lots of people talked about grandfathering existing STRs. People did not want to set the cap below the current amount. Someone suggested making licenses fungible, the assets that could be traded. One person mentioned that capping and multiple STR ownership could be interlinked. So making sure that if you are grandfathering, you're not going to let all of the ones be grandfathered to new owners in a family. One person suggested that as the housing stock increases, you could increase the cap. So by actual numbers, so really focusing more on percentage. So that was a couple of those comments. And when asked sort of what problem does this solve, one person thought, well, it'll satisfy people who want to regulate STRs. You could address STR density in certain areas. You could address congestion. You could address noise and nuisance in those areas, protect year-round neighborhoods, and stop people from buying STRs only to be buying properties in order to turn them into STRs for that purpose. And then the point John made, prevent it from future oversaturation of STRs by just having a safeguard and a cap. So I think we all sort of have an understanding of what data would be needed, how many housing units, how many STRs, where are they? And a few people though use this as a chance to say, well, we need to at least know that that STRs are even a problem. And one person suggested knowing what voters want as a limit would be data to help, and how many people use this to be able to afford their homes. So intended impacts lowers the value of real estate. If homes cannot pass on the right to rent, that could be a positive impact if you're trying to make homes more affordable. It could be a negative impact if you own a home and you want it to have real estate value. And then the same sort of potential impacts people have mentioned is if you actually are going to really decrease tourists, that has an impact. So if you're going to have fewer visitors, you're going to have all those other impacts. Prevent more affordable homes from being bought up. Of course, you're going to make developers angry because if they're trying to just develop properties as short-term rentals, you may make them angry. I just quoted here. Negative consequences or unintended consequences. Again, negative impacts on the tourist economy, perhaps less economic diversity. If new buyers are not going to be able to use rental income to be able to afford their home, they would then only wealthy owners would be able to purchase houses if we were at the cap. Could limit flexibility, as Julia said, of year-round residents to rent their homes in the future or their ability to buy a home. Policies about monitoring and how to make those decisions. So those were, but a number of people, Julia mentioned the things you said here about seen as an unfair for those who might want to rent in the future, et cetera. How this would meet policy goals. So a couple people think it would have a major impact in preserving neighborhoods, potentially increasing affordability. It could have a major or moderate effect on those things. It could have a moderate or neutral effect on noise. And people seem to think it was fairly clear. Well, I guess that was all mixed, right? So a lot of mixed, but, and then additional explanations. It depends on which thing you picked. So it's kind of hard to rate. And so basically people said that their ratings were, someone said their ratings were based on preventing future overgrowth. And then questions or next steps. As you all have sort of said, we have heard from some people, seems promising, but maybe not right now, maybe too controversial. And again, the request of how many people really need this to maintain their homes. And that if it were geographic, maybe neighborhoods should have some voice in making decisions for their own neighborhoods on what percentage or what the amounts should be. Jim?
I just want to say I sympathize with the people who say a cap would be good because it would stop, this 20% or whatever from burgeoning. But I think we can do that with other policy levers, such as only one STR per owner, per natural person, while perhaps grandfathering in those that exist. And the business entities, other policy levers like that, I think can handle that issue long-term more effectively and with less controversy. What I'm really concerned about is I feel like a cap immediately creates winners and losers. And I think that would make it very hard for voters to accept it. I understand how it seems like a good idea, but I mean, just with the discussions we've had tonight, I just feel like it creates contention without trying to. It creates contentiousness. It's certainly appealing, but I'm concerned that it has more of a downside than an upside, and that we can control growth through other means that seem more even-handed. Thank you.
Thanks. Dave.
Listen, if the other levers will do it, Jim, I'm all for it. I think, one of the reasons why I'm interested in it is just because we can preserve certain neighborhoods, which are more traditionally local neighborhoods, by putting in a more restrictive cap or some regulation. It doesn't have to be a cap, some regulation that preserves their right at some level to rent, but makes it less attractive for either the corporate owner or for the speculator. And because that's the way we have continue the legacy of losing year-round housing. And I'm saying that I think STRs are responsible for it, but they own a part of it. And I think if this trend continues, then more year-round neighborhoods are at risk of being penetrated by this.
Yeah. And just to sort of name, I want to sort of name, we haven't talked about this lever specifically or doing it in this way, but right, you can always have these, I don't know, you could check legally, is there a way for these levers to apply differently to whole home versus room in home? And that might be a way to get at, hosted versus not hosted or something like that. Might that be a way to get at Julia's concern about year-round residents? And I don't know, again, what the legal implications of those kinds of things are, but, could you have caps that applied to non-hosted or to you know, but without having caps for hosted. I don't know.
I mean, there's towns that have different restrictions in different zoning districts on STR. So I think it's possible for sure.
Kathy.
And I think the question too has there been growth? Is there growth? And the data will show us that. I think we'll see over time when we get that information. There's because we've had such a long history of short-term rentals, it's possible that it's almost somewhat a stabilized thing. We have a finite island. There can only be so many. And I know that caps on building permits didn't fare very well with the voters. So I think that I agree with Jim and that it's a controversial topic to bring up in that point. And then I think also it gets very complicated if we were to go down the route, which I think if we did this, people would want to do it by neighborhood because zoning doesn't make any sense. The zoning is just all over the place and there's so many exceptions to zones that you're in that it wouldn't work. So for example, out in Tom Nevers is lug 3, that's 3 acres, but there's so many tiny properties like mine, less than a quarter an acre. Maybe my property is a problem because it's very dense, but I'm in a really good zone where it doesn't look like I'm dense. So I think that it would take a lot of work to do anything on this right now and get it right. So there's so many reasons for me to say not now. And I think we can definitely control the growth with other levers that are that have different contexts, but would have the same kind of control of growth. Thanks.
Thanks. Julia.
So I kind of like what you said, Stacy, and I think that has been done. And then what Dave sort of said, so that you could have different types of licenses, right? I think that I was trying to figure out if Brookline or Cambridge or who's the one that I've seen in Massachusetts at least, but you see these actually pretty routinely. Like what I was reading today about Bozeman, they were like, oh yeah, we have type A, type B, type C, and we're capping this type, but we're not capping that type. Like, so, I mean, obviously that's an option. It's just what this group wants to do. I think it's a little, and I think I know where Jim is coming from, but I do think, when Jim talks about, you talk about grandfathering and then you say picking winners and losers. I mean, grandfathering definitely picks winners and losers. So in terms of, giving people a big windfall on the value of their home and not others. So, I think that there's advantages and disadvantages, but to all of these things, but the winner and loser situation applies to other scenarios as well.
Thanks. John?
Yeah, thanks, Stacey. I'd just like to follow up on what Dave said about loss of housing in more affordable areas. And Jim, I'd love to, give it time and wait and see, but I just think we don't have any more time in some of these areas. And, the data will sort of show us, but I don't think we can wait and see and have 2, 3, 4, 5 more years of losing homes to become STRs because we can't get them back again. Once they've gone, they've gone. So I would love to take a bit of a wait and see, but I don't think in this case that's the right thing to do. And I do think some form of capping is going to have to be a part of the mix. I did think that it's got to be a balance, though, of this and some of our other levers. I just think this is the one, though, that has probably the most solid, result if you do it. But not to rule out everything else, but I think we need to do it sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Karen and Peter, and then we will, I think unless anyone else wants to speak to this one who hasn't, and otherwise we'll move on to the next one. Karen?
Sorry, I agree with a lot of what Jim said, and that kind of thought of, are there other ways to achieve the same goal that would be simpler and have less winners and losers? And I've been thinking about, should we be thinking about if the goal is, or one area of consensus that we seem to have is to limit, for example, business entities and for-profit motive and things like that. What are the levers we're considering, which ones would have an effect on that? And, you know, could we get a fair ways by looking at some of those other levers, like having, you know, only 1 or 2 properties per owner, or having it be natural persons and defining it that way. I do understand the idea of the caps, you know, especially in areas that have more affordable housing. But like Julia said, the problem is if people want to rent later or use that to help them buy a house and things like that, it seems very complicated. And so how could we do that in a way that is elegant, that prevents, and I guess, would the idea of having these investors not be able to do that, would that help solve that problem in the affordable housing areas too? If that makes sense.
Thanks, Karen. Peter.
I guess the sad part is that there's not a similar committee like ours looking into the affordable housing problem that should have probably been solved 20 years ago. We have, you know, a million different little things going on, but nothing concrete and big. And this isn't going to solve the affordable housing problem. I think what it could do is create bigger problems with the residents who live in the affordable areas, because it lowers the value of their homes if you put a cap on them. And I understand completely, David, about, you know, you don't want to ruin these neighborhoods. But at the same time, if these people value goes down because a developer can't come in and buy that house and make a multi-million-dollar house, it becomes a bigger problem, I think, perhaps in their future going down the road.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So, all right, let's now look at the next lever, which is to limit the number of short-term rental contracts that any particular unit might have, rental might have. So I first asked people, if you were to support limiting the number of rental contracts, which approach would you favor? And half of the respondents said limit the total number in a year. 30% said high season, or I guess 40% said high season, but defined it differently. And one person added their own other, which was limit commercial rentals, which is not this mechanism, but okay. So there was a number of comments about high season, and if we were gonna, if you were interested in limiting during high season and allowing unlimited during the year, or the other times, what would that be? And we heard just July and August. Some said plus shoulder season. Yeah, so 2 people said just July and August, and others said with a shoulder season. So my comment here about June was overruled by at least 2 people saying, like, no, it should be July and August, and others who said you should have it all the way through the shoulder seasons. Okay, so then what would this tool be solving? A number of people said high turnover and churn, intensity of use and infrastructure strain, incentivizing longer term rentals, address or prevent or reverse affordable housing, preserve the character, avoid noise and nuisance, and reducing the total number of vacation renters. Interestingly, no one at this point saw this mechanism as a way to reduce commercial renting, which is, I think, one of the things that was described that is like, you can't make a living if you only can rent it a certain number of times. So it might discourage purely commercial entities from wanting to enter the Nantucket real estate market. I think someone might have mentioned that later on in the survey, but no one mentioned it at this point in the survey. Julia?
That's really interesting, Stacy, because obviously this is the level. I mean, there are obviously others, but what Karen was saying is, how are you going to differentiate? And you can't really differentiate, easily. And so the way you would do it is if you don't want, whatever the entity is, to use a home purely as an STR, then you limit the amount of time that they can do it, or the amount of ways that they can do it, right? And I don't know, I mean, this seems to me like, and there could potentially be, like, I think if you, like, I don't know that this group has really talked about, like, there could be like a 2-year period before this is in place, or whatever, like a big window where you say, okay, we're not going to institute this next year. It's going to be like, but it's going to start, the clock's going to start to give you kind of a warning and a heads up. But this is a tool that I would think, depending on the number of contracts, definitely deter, no one's ever going to live in the house and it's only going to be used as an STR. The question is the number. And I think the big question is enforcement on this one. And that's, we can't necessarily solve that question, but I hope the answer is it's possible.
Yeah. David.
Listen, I have a bunch of concerns. I mean, I understand what Julia just said, that this is the basics, but so let's say we say, okay, you can only have a certain amount, and everyone's going to jump on the profitable times, right? They're going to not keep any powder dry. Then we come to the off seasons and everyone's maxed out their rentals. And so that would seriously negatively affect businesses on the island. So, and it's also wide open to abuse. People can rent for a long time, sublease to their neighbor next door at home, and how would you ever know that? You would never know that. And you wouldn't be able, it would create a black market, I think, in some ways. So I just think there's, as much as I appreciate it, I think that it leaves too much room for people to cheat the system. And then I would just worry about how it would affect the shoulder seasons, because most people, I think, would rent during the on season when rates are the highest, and then the shoulder seasons would pay the price.
Yeah. Julia.
So is a different way to do it then, because Dave, I get what you're saying, like I get it. One of the things that resonates with me in here, and having looked at the historical data that AirDNA does provide, this is only the platforms, but the average stay has, and I think any realtor will tell you, the average stay has definitely come down, right? Because for many reasons, it's easier to get to, it's, all this stuff. But so there may be a different way to get to this. Maybe it's, maybe you have a minimum stay during certain periods. Maybe you have a maximum number of days over the year. I don't know, because I hear what you're saying about
restrict just the summer period, and then you remove the restriction for the shoulder seasons. I don't know.
Yeah, but then how are you preventing what you just said in terms of trying to prevent homes from coming out of the year-round pool? Like, aren't you just?
Well, I think it's I think all of these, the devil's in the details, and it's a concern about for one, it's an easily played game for this one. Okay, move to longer rental periods, we're going to just have a side deal to rent for the other two half to someone else we know. So that's a concern. And then the shoulder seasons. With all of these, I think, though, any of these levers, they do come with the possibility of abuse.
I agree with you. And I think, Dave, anyone who's willing to cheat is going to cheat, right? We can't stop that. But that's not something, I mean, if someone's not reporting on their taxes every year, we can't, we're not going to change their minds.
But some levers will have an easier path to that.
Yeah, I agree.
So that's just my concern with this particular lever. I know I sound like a downer, but I just have concerns with the way we're doing this. And to think that this is going to change the churn, I'm not sure it will, because you can't rent it. Chances are someone else is going to use it. So there's still going to be people in the house, especially on season, so these houses will be used whether they're rented or not.
Peter?
I'm just confused. I don't know why this was originally incorporated into the discussion. I was under the impression when we first came up with this concept that it was to cut back on the hustle and bustle of 3 people, 3 different groups moving into a house in a 7-day period, the turnover, the churn. Now I see it being used as a way to restrict short-term rentals in general. It's the danger. The danger is that I don't think we can make a real decision that makes any sense at this point. We still have to wait for that information that we've been waiting for. And I don't quite understand how this would have any real effect on anything. I mean, if we want to, we could say, okay, summer, you can only rent for a week or more. You can't rent by the day. But as we know, that would hurt a lot of people who rent by the weekends. So I think it becomes really, really difficult. I mean, if you look at the number that was recommended by many of the towns that do have restrictions, they were recommending, it ended up being a lot of periods that you could rent, enough that it really wouldn't have an impact like on the current situation.
Julia?
I'm sending you, Stacy. I just remembered someone had shared this a while back, a town that has this type of lever, in case we would want to understand if their experience had gone well. And that's the town of Woodstock, Vermont. Obviously, they're a winter town, not a summer town, but their number's pretty small, and they have a different, different market, but they certainly, I think similarly don't have many big hotels and stuff like that. I think they just do 6 contracts per year, which is this, that's not a big number. But anyways, I'll send this to you in case it's helpful, and maybe we want to reach out to them and see what they found, if it's had an impact on churn or.
And we do, just to remind you, right, Palm Springs has a limit on the number of weeks, and their most recent law lowered that limit. So I think it had been 32 and they lowered it to 26. I think that's what they said. I can't fully remember, right? So, and again, like there's a difference between the year round, people want to go there year round. So those numbers, the numbers shouldn't necessarily tell you the same thing, but it would be interesting. We could follow up on like, well, why did they decide to lower the number? Was it that it wasn't working, or that it was working well and they thought it was time to like, who knows?
I think the one thing we're leaving out is the fact that we're a resort community. Woodstock really isn't, and Woodstock has loads of inns. They might not have as many rentals, they have loads of inns. And Palm Springs is a totally different bird. We have people that want to come here for 2 days to look at the museums, and we don't have hotels.
People go skiing for 2 days too in Woodstock, right?
But they have other alternatives. They can go to the town next door.
I understand, but I'm just saying if they've had a good experience, it could be good information, that's all.
I mean, Woodstock is not known for skiing. Suicide 6 is not a real ski mountain.
Okay, so I think, it's a good discussion. What would be the purpose of this, right? And we're hearing from some of you that, to the extent it could limit business entities, right? We did have, here's where somebody did name that. reducing incentives for investor-only short-term rentals as an alternative or in conjunction with the true person policy, and to encourage homes that are used in part by families. But other than that, mostly people were naming that it would have more to do with the churn, as Peter mentioned, or reducing short-term rentals altogether. Unintended consequences, again, some people mentioned difficult to enforce. You could set the number at the wrong place. You're going to limit income. And it could have all the other negative impacts that reducing tourism might have. Surprisingly or interestingly, very few, only one person gave this the highest major effect. Sorry, we will change that to say effect, not affect. Only one person said that this would have a major effect. A couple, moderate effects, a lot of neutral or negative. So overall, not a ton on this. But again, people said hard to know if we don't know what the amount is. People weren't really sure about how helpful it would be. So any other comments on this mechanism, Kathy?
This is a less on this particular one and maybe more in general,
yeah.
Is with less than 1,000 hotel rooms on the island, B&Bs and hotel rooms in a tourist industry, then 80–90% of the people who come to visit the island stay in someone's home. So really what we're talking about here and any restrictions is how many fewer tourists we want to have on the island. And that's a valid question to ask because there won't be any place for them to stay. And that was intentional by the town when they created the restriction on the number of hotels. So that's a conversation that we need to have. I see Mary shaking her head and looking disdainfully at me now, but I'm not quite sure if the people can't stay and we don't really have a day tripper kind of place. I think if the town wants to reduce tourism by 15%, 20%, that would be good to know, because maybe that's really what the issue is. And then what kind of impact does that have on the economy and the taxes and who pays them and all that? So I just think that's part of every single lever we're doing here, is what kind of impact will that have on the people who can visit this island?
Yeah, thanks. Karen?
I don't really love this lever, but if it's in comparison to doing something like saying you have to have a week-long stay, I think this could be easier to enforce. And perhaps you could, I was just thinking, let's say you had 10 weeks, and I know that's too many, but let's say you had 10 weeks. If you're trying to encourage people to stay a little bit longer, have a little bit less churn, then maybe you could set the number of rentals at number of contracts at say 15. So you could rent for the week, but then you could also have some that were 3, and I'm just arbitrarily using those numbers, but you could have a combination of some longer and some shorter maybe. But I think this could be more elegant and easier to work with than trying to categorize and keep track of, the how many in a week, which seems like it could get kind of dicey to figure out.
Yeah. Mary, I saw you were shaking your head before, but I wondered, did you want to speak? Did you want to say anything?
No.
Okay. Jim.
I agree with Karen. I don't love this, but I sort of like it in some ways. I do think the one rental contract per week is still a good idea, and it could be in conjunction with this. I'm not a huge fan of this, but I do want to say possibly if there were a limit, it might goad some renters and property owners to go toward, let's say, 2-week rentals sometimes, because an owner could still fill out a summer that way. And maybe that would be at least a little bit of a nod or a return to the older days of Nantucket, where people came longer. And I realize it's a different world now, but if it had that effect at all, it would be sort of a nice effect. But I don't see this as a hugely important lever. Thank you.
John? John?
Yeah, I kind of agree with what Dave said about enforcement. I think it was Dave about enforcement. But is there any real harm in reaching out, as Julia suggested, to Woodstock and just hearing what they have to say for half an hour? I mean, we might learn something about this, and we may learn something about things around their SGR thing. So what's the harm in listening to Woodstock?
Yeah,
I'd do it. I would agree with Julia.
Yeah, and at this point, here's my recommendation about how we might hear from other communities, just given the availability of time. I wonder if we want a volunteer from the group who's willing to call and try to just have a conversation that they can then report back to the group what they've learned, because I don't think we're gonna have time to pull together another panel. And if we did, as I've been hearing here, this is not people's favorite mechanism. So I'm not sure that that would be the one we would want to spend the group's time on. But, I know, like Jim, early on, you just reached out to Palm Springs and were able to bring back some really good information before we did the panel. So I don't know, John, if you had time and wanted to just reach out, and if the group felt comfortable with that, or if there's some other member of the group who might want to just reach out and learn a little more from Woodstock, that would be
I can make the time, but I don't want to do that if it's for me. Like if everybody's saying this is not important anyway, well, you know what, let's I don't want to do it really if there's only very lukewarm.
Okay, well, let me do a quick little poll here. I haven't done this before, so let's see if it works. Does that work? Did you guys see a poll?
Yep. Yep.
All right. It should read, should John reach out to Woodstock? Go ahead and vote. Yes, no. We don't know who does what, so it's anonymous.
How do you vote?
Oh, unfortunately, it says hosts and panelists can't vote. It's public.
Yeah.
Well, that gets rid of that. Okay, good to know. We can't do that. All right. Well, we can check with people, but why don't anyone raise your hand? You want John to reach out to Woodstock? You think that's a worthwhile thing to do? We see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hands. So there you go, John.
Okay. I will take that on. Julie, did you say you had something?
I will send it to you. Actually, I sent it to Stacy, so maybe Stacy can share it.
Yeah, I'll look for it.
And on it's a you can, if you scroll down, you'll see contact info.
Can I just ask if there's one other person that would join me on the calls if I set them up?
Can't do that. Please don't, because then we've got open meeting law issues.
Well, two people isn't.
We have been told by town council that they do not want more than one person meeting about this. I know that technically the rules are a quorum, but each town interprets this as they wish, and I try to just follow the town's dictates. So that's what I'm going to do. Sorry.
Okay.
All right. Sorry about that. Yeah, unless we get different advice from the town about that. But what I have been told is we're going to avoid having 2 or more people in direct conversations about short-term rentals outside of the meetings. Okay, so now is our wrap up and next steps. Here's what I'm thinking. We've talked about a number of mechanisms. I think it would be good to just do a little roundup from people. I could do a little poll that I send out after the meeting of like, where are you on these? What are you thinking? The other thing though, I do want to kind of test is to go back to why are we doing this? So we started this process with what's the reason for regulating short-term rentals? And honestly, you all were all over the place and did not agree, right? There was a real lack of alignment on why short-term rental regulation should be done on Nantucket. And now we've been talking about this for quite a while, and I want to go back around it. So, you know, for example, on this call, in this meeting, we heard, you know, limiting business entities. We've heard that regularly. My sense is there's a lot of support for that. Even if it's not because it's a problem today, it's because we've heard from people, we really don't want that to become the future of Nantucket, that like business entities come in and take over all of our residential housing, right? We heard about reducing the churn. We've heard about, do we actually want to reduce the number of tourists? We had heard that when we first, when I had my first conversations with people, right? And people said, it's just too crowded. We have too much crowding. We have, you know, congestion, all of these things. But then when we look at things like these mechanisms that would actually seek to get the level of short-term rentals lower than they are now, people seemed less in favor of that than they seemed in, let's just make sure it doesn't get too big, right? So I want to do a little survey for you all that goes back around what the mechanisms we've looked at so far and gets a sense of where you are on those. But B, also just goes back around like, what do you really want short-term rental regulations to do? What are you interested in, given what you know so far? What do you think the need is, and what is the outcome you are actually hoping to have happen coming out of this process, right? I think maybe a third piece can be, what other mechanisms that we haven't talked about do you still want to talk about that you think might be promising, right? And so that's my proposal to you as a sort of next step between now and the next meeting. What do people think of that? See heads nodding. Anyone want to add anything I should consider as I do this? Yeah, John.
Yeah, I agree. I think it'd be a very good thing to do. I would like to add one thing though, yeah. And please don't shut me down, Stacey. I'm getting increasingly worried that we don't know the answer to a very important question. And that is, what if one of the 4 articles that are up for discussion, citizens articles that are up for discussion at the Maytown meeting, what if one of them passes? What does that mean for us and our November article? Because the easiest one to understand, forgive me, Julia, but the easiest one to understand is Article 60. If Article 60 passes, what does that mean in whatever article we want to bring forward? Do we just ignore that? or is that now already become law? I think we need to, understand from town council, what if, hopefully, what if one or more of these articles pass? What does it mean for us as a group? Because in the beginning, it didn't really matter because they were all going to be considered in May. Now they're not. So I would like to add that somehow to this.
Yeah, so, but it sounds to me, John, that's not a survey question for the group. That's
maybe not, but it's my chance to get in with the email.
Okay. Fair enough. And I think I will not only not shut you down, I will express my appreciation for raising this because we did talk about bringing town council a set of questions that we might want answered. We did that at the beginning, right? And they gave us a memo, and then we had a subgroup meeting to talk through it. We could do that again. So a question that John has is, what happens if any of these articles pass? I assume there's going to be a different answer depending on which article. So we can ask town council that question. Do people have other questions right now for town council? I think, John, for example, you had mentioned at our last meeting that it would be helpful to ask town council about the mechanisms we are looking at. And are any of these illegal and we should stop looking at them entirely? So we can ask town council.
That was my other one. Yes.
Yeah. Does anyone have any other questions that you would like passed on to town council?
Almost all the levers need to have a legal opinion.
Right. That's what I was saying. The policy mechanisms, the levers that we have been looking at so far, does town council want to tell us if it, preliminarily, if any of those sort of seem off the table legally? Yeah. Tom.
Stacey, as you said before, it appears that there's some support on the group for possibly this commercial/business entity provision or provisions, depending on the definition. So I'm kind of thinking that if we ask town council what they thought of particularly the Palm Springs provision, obviously it'd have to be applicable to Massachusetts, but just as that is a jumping off point, if we were to take that and make it and write it for Massachusetts, just theoretically, what would be their gauge of that? I think that might be interesting for us then I'm sure we're going to have another discussion on that to jump off from there.
Yeah, and just to say, Tom, actually, we asked them that one in the first round. So if you go back to that memo, it's question number 2, and I will throw the answer that they said to that one in the chat, which was that they think it would be fine if you're regulating the class of operators. And then to make sure that those definitions match with the general or zoning bylaws that exist. And so I guess, Megan, then that would probably then be a question for you to bring back to your team on, on definitions. Kathy.
I think when we asked him that first, I think we talked about commercial entities, but I think that true person thing is a different nuance. And so he may have a different response to that. And if so, that's, we just need to hear that, because I don't know that was part of it. I thought we were asking, we didn't have that concept way back when, did we?
We did. I just put it in here. This is exactly what we asked him.
Right. But did we talk about a true person?
Yeah, a natural person.
Okay. I'm sorry, I missed that. Thank you.
Jim.
I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, Kathy, are you still talking?
Sorry, you had something else, Kathy?
No, okay. I just wanted to say for that original session, I actually wrote it down. I quoted Palm Springs. I said, this is from Palm Springs. Would this be legal in Massachusetts? And he replied, yes, it would, because in Massachusetts, we have the power to determine type of ownership. but it doesn't hurt to go over it again. But it was actually with specific language because I thought it was powerful language. That's why I brought it up.
Yeah. And I do want to clarify, Tom, when I said, limiting business entities seemed to be a goal, I don't necessarily mean any particular policy mechanism to get you there, right? The group is exploring different policy mechanisms, but it did seem to me a place where the majority, though not all, members of this group seem to be, to see some potential value in some kind of mechanisms that might achieve that goal. And that seemed a little more than we've heard on anything else so far. So
yeah, and that's the bottom line of what I was trying to say. It's just fostering more discussion around that, and that's something that we did in our in-person 6-hour meeting. We spoke a lot about that.
Yeah, perfect. All right, I want to open this up for any public comments. So I invite any attendees to raise their hand. Well, first I will invite our alternates, and then, but meanwhile, any attendees feel free to put your hand raised, or I don't know, Sinead, if you have to click something to let them do that, but if so, do so, please.
They raise their hands and then I can allow them to talk, I think is the way it goes. So I'll keep an eye out for raised hands.
All right, perfect, thank you. So John.
Well, first off, thank you very much for the opportunity. As always, I thought this was a good discussion tonight. And Stacy, thank you again. A couple quick thoughts, if I may. First, a lot of the polling that you're suggesting that you now do, for me at least, some of the answers are dependent on the data that we get from Matt. I am, from the get-go, from the very beginning of our meetings, way back when, I know I said that I was very data-driven and that I wanted evidence to suggest that a particular policy relates to a particular outcome based on evidence that we have. So I'm really looking forward to what Matt comes up with at our next meeting. And to some extent, an answer to a poll may vary depending on exactly what he finds. So I just worry a little bit about the timing on that. I do like the idea of going back to a town council. I think it's important, very much so, that we make sure that whatever we do is both legal and constitutional. And it makes sense to know that before we adopt a particular policy. I think John's position on that makes a lot of sense. I want to identify also with Jim's comment, which I think is important, that we not reach out to the very and most controversial items as we try to reach consensus as a group. Consensus defined, I know not 100%, but at least what, 80% or 85%. I think Jim is absolutely dead on right about that. And then finally, as someone who is now retired from, but spent 25 years teaching graduate students about policy implementation at the graduate level at Carnegie Mellon University, to me, how you implement policy is really important for policy makers. When you begin a program or adopt a program, I think we have to think in terms of how will this be implemented? What is its impact on individuals, citizens, property owners, residents of Nantucket, seasonal residents, the whole gamut. And I, again, want to just suggest to my voting colleagues, since I am there really without a vote and only a voice at this point, that thinking about how each of the policies that may ultimately be adopted, how they're going to be implemented, is a really key part of the total discussion. Stacy, thank you, and thank you to everybody. I appreciate the chance to talk.
Thanks, John. And just to note, right, we've had this chicken and egg with the data. Initially, we've had maybe we should all go on hiatus until the data's here, and that was not a popular plan. So, we're doing the best we can to discuss these things, and we know we're going to have to come back around as we have more data. Are there any members of the public who would like to speak? seeing none. I'm going to just then come back to sort of action items. And I know, Kathy, there was one you wanted to mention. So why don't you do so now?
Okay, and following up to the thing you circulated to all the group, I think Megan sent it out about the article in the paper about the VRBO thing that came out that's now circulating around in the news that everybody should see. I thought I wanted to bring up again and see what the group thought, since these articles are going to be these STR articles. The town has basically said their recommendations in the warrant say that they're recommending that the voters don't adopt. And I think there are 4 or 5 different articles. I'm not sure which right now at the top of my head. But that doesn't mean that that's what the voters will do at town meeting. So like John said, some of them could pass, multiple ones could pass, who knows what's going to happen. So I just think that since these are being, the public is being asked to wait on these articles until we get our job done and we bring our opportunity and our proposals to the special town meeting. I think that it's pretty important for our group to understand amongst ourselves what each of the articles mean. What are those policy levers that are in them mean, so that we aren't the only people not discussing it, because the town, I think, sort of expects us to, because they've said, oh, we're deferring on your judgment to it. So I would suggest that it would be a good idea, although I know everyone's tired of the policy lever evaluation, if we were to, evaluate each of these as policies, because that's what they are. They are being put before the town as policies to become bylaws, and evaluate them like we've evaluated all the other ones that have come before us. So that's my proposal. That's what I'm suggesting that we do. It's more homework, but I think that's important for us to talk about them and make sure we understand them and what they mean. Just think about what they could mean, or what the unintended consequence, and all of that stuff, like we do with all the other policy levers. So I'm just throwing it out there as a proposal of something that we should do.
So I'm under the impression that if 60 gets passed or whatever gets passed, that being that it's going to take 2 years to implement anything that happens, that anything that gets passed could be overturned at the next town, at the special town meeting. So it's not like we're going to be living with if it gets passed for the rest of our lives. It will probably never be implemented, or it will be changed or adopted, whatever. So I think that's the situation at this point with that. I'm not disagreeing with studying the articles. I only think there's 2, not 4, but it might be worth looking at.
John? Oh, no, there's 58, 59, 60, and 61. Yeah, 4.
And there's also 40, which we were mentioned under that one, and I have no idea why they deferred on that one to the short-term rental work group, because that's about fractional ownership, which we haven't talked about at all. So I think we ought to be able to speak to them and understand them.
Yeah, so let me ask a question, because I don't know if they were planning on having me join the select board meeting this week or next week, but it might be an opportunity for me to ask for clarification from the select board as to whether they would like us to be specifically speaking about these articles and evaluating them as part of our task. Is that what their deferrals meant, or did they mean something different, right? Because some of these, I have trouble sort of like, if I ask you all like a bit at a time, right? Like rental of dwelling units should be excluded from the definition of commercial zoning. Like, how do we evaluate that on its own using the tools we have? Seems seems difficult, right? So I'm not quite sure, Kathy, how we would do that with the sort of criteria we've created. So I guess what I would do is, what I would propose is that I get a little more clarity from the select board when I next present to them about how they would like our group to be responding to that.
Well, there may be parts of them that we decide, well, you know what, we like that part.
Well, then I think how that is managed. Yeah, and I do think the way that is managed is by, I'm going to, in my survey, say, what other mechanisms do you actually think are promising that you want to evaluate? And I think that's different than let's evaluate someone's proposal that we think is better, right?
Well, Stacey, can I, with respect, just disagree? Because I do think we need to specifically look at these so that everyone, you know, on our team has looked at them, not sort of generally. Here they are, the thing's getting printed next week. It's already up online. And I think, you know, Kathy might have a point. There might be some things in here that we do want and, or might fit. I think we have to really speak about them, you know, as they're printed, not a more general thing. That would be me. I support you, Kathy. We should do that.
Yeah. Okay. So what I would ask then, if you are interested in talking about policy mechanisms that are part of proposals that are part of the citizen petitions, like, please specify that in my survey so that we will then know who is interested and how many of you are interested in talking about the mechanisms and how you would want to talk about them. Do you want to talk about them one little piece at a time? That is, do we want to redefine what owner occupied means and look at that as one mechanism? Or do you want to look at the entire package of pieces as one mechanism? Because I don't really know. I do want to be really clear that our ground rules stated, and that all but one member of this group agreed, that this group was not going to support the citizen petition articles. That does not affect you as a voter at town meeting. You as a voter at town meeting can do as you wish, right? This is not to infringe upon your democratic right, but that this working group as a working group was not going to support these articles. So even if you decide you like them, like we're not analyzing them to see whether you like them as a group, right? If there are things you want, if you look at them and think these are things I think are really promising, you should bring them to the group as mechanisms to be evaluated.
Or really dangerous.
Sure, I guess. But if nobody in this group is bringing them, then there's no need to evaluate them as dangerous, because they're not going to end up the proposals of this group. So, okay, so I know we do now have a member of the public who wants to speak. I do have one additional update that Tom reminded me of, which was at the last meeting, you all requested time to speak at town meeting as a committee to update on our progress. I did have some preliminary communication with the town moderator, who was open to us doing it. Her suggestion was that the moment for us to do that would be in discussion of these citizen petition articles. And I haven't had the opportunity to follow up to make clear to her that this group would not be speaking about any of the citizen petition articles. And so to really confirm if that's really the way she wants to have us do that. If it's our only way in, I might be inclined for us to find some way to do it, but that the nature of the conversation would be agreed upon by all members of this group. That is whatever we present. And B, would really be focused on, here's an update on the progress of where we are, what we're talking about, what we are considering, and would not be about specifically about the content of the citizen petition articles. With that, I want to turn to Virginia and Bob Vidoni. You should be able to.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hear me?
Yes.
Hi. My name is Virginia Vidoni, and my husband and I have been renting our home on Nantucket for 24 years, almost 25. So we have a lot of experience with renting. We rent to mostly the same families that come back year after year. But in the 24 to 25 years we've been renting, things have changed considerably. And I think you need to be aware of what it's like now trying to rent homes. People cannot afford, normal families cannot come to Nantucket for more than a week and feed their family and bring a car over. It's just not that way anymore. And it's not going to become that way anymore. It's too expensive. And so when you're making rules about how long we can rent for and how many contracts we have, please take into consideration that things have changed dramatically in the 24 years we've been doing this. We still get wonderful, wonderful families, but they're there for a week. And they're not wealthy. I mean, there are people whose grandparents come and their grandchildren, and they're wonderful families, but they're not there for 2 weeks or a month. So the reality is important.
Thanks, Virginia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have another member of the public who would like to speak. So David. You should be able to unmute. David Callahan, are you able to unmute?
You may be asking the wrong person. You're asking us to unmute again.
Oh, no, sorry. I was trying to ask David and then the spaces moved in my thing. David, are you able to unmute? It does not seem so. Oh, yes? No. Okay. Well, David, sorry about that. Do feel free to send an email to me, stacy@cbi.org, and I will be happy to make sure your message gets heard, seen by the short-term rental work group. So with that, and only 2 minutes over, I want to thank you all for your participation in this meeting and the process. And we will be meeting again in 2 weeks. If there's if Matt needs our input on anything, or there's an opportunity for helping him weigh his decisions on which platforms to use, we will announce that and have a subgroup meeting prior to that. And otherwise, you should look forward to getting some surveys in the email. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks, Stacy.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Stacy.